Star Wars The Grey War, Chapters 18 through 24 by Nathan Brown.
Star Wars The Grey War, Chapter 18. Naaman and his generals sat around a table watching the response from the Jedi. An old human man spoke to them slowly and firmly. The calm, controlled way he talked seemed even more threatening than if he had been yelling and screaming at them. You have forced the Jedi into a corner because you think we are weak. You see us as less dangerous because of our peaceful nature. You will soon learn how wrong you are. We agree to meet you in 2 weeks on Quill, the moon of Phant. No civilians or non-force sensitives will be involved. I urge you to reconsider your challenge. The Jedi have never been destroyed and we will not fall to you. There was a moment of silence for what felt like a minute after the message shut off, freezing on the man's cold, hard face. Naaman was extremely relieved that they had finally received a response. He looked around at the faces of his generals. They all seemed so worried. He understood their sudden fear. It had all been fine when they were training and planning, but now that they had received a response, it seemed all too real. Now they truly had to think about what would happen when they fought the Jedi. They had to realize that even if they won, many of them would still die. I know that though it's bouncing in your head right now, you are counting the cost and risks of the coming battle. But we have the chance to do something no one has ever done, to wipe out the Jedi. They're offering themselves up to us. We have the chance, not to damage them or to cut down their numbers, but to completely exterminate them. We are followers of the dark side. This is not the time for caution or hesitation. We need to work. The dark side is about struggling through to gain influence among our peers and control over those beneath us. Even if many of us perish to attain this victory, once the Jedi are gone no one will be able to stop us. The faces around him changed to reflect hesitant hopefulness. He knew his mission and he didn't question his allegiance, but he couldn't help but feel bad for the men and women sitting around this table. He'd trained with them, taught them and learned from them. Now he was betraying them like it was nothing. They would all be massacred by the Jedi. He knew it served his purposes, but it still felt like too much. These were Darksiders who'd done nothing against him, yet he was killing them all. He took a deep breath and steeled his mind, pushing out any hesitation or feelings of pity. He still had more planning to do. Scene change. Kinza sat in the belly of a transport ship, trying in vain to still her shaking body. She and her comrades were sitting in a row, flying at light speed towards Quill, only 2 days remaining until the decided meeting between the Jedi and the Bogan. Meeting. She wasn't fooling anyone, certainly not herself. It would be a bloody war and, even if the Jedi won, she would lose people she cared for on both sides. When she'd first taken this mission, she was excited to take down this cult and destroy Rogan. Now she didn't know. She'd formed a relationship with these people and the thought of them dying upset her. So, here she was, surrounded by her squad, by her friends, shaking from nervousness and excitement. She wasn't even sure how she would escape once they landed on Quill. After her display of lightning, she was constantly catching people staring at her and hearing their whispers about her. She was no random, faceless soldier who could sneak away without being noticed. She was a part of a small elite group who would be the first ones meeting the Jedi. She wasn't strong enough to defeat the entire squad, and they would certainly try to stop her if she tried to run away. She wasn't even sure then why the Jedi would even recognize her with her new robes, mask and her strange appearance. She wasn't even sure she should leave as soon as she landed. She wanted to find a way to make sure Rogan died. She had a strange, sinking feeling that, even if everyone else on the planet died, Jedi and Bogan alike, Rogan would get away. Scene change. A lump of bile seemed to be pressing on Naaman's throat. It felt like he was constantly a second away from throwing up. He had never been surrounded by so much of the light side. It seemed to him like the air here was thicker than on every other planet. He could still breathe it, but he had a harder time sucking it in. He looked around to see how his army was faring. If everyone was disaffected, they may not even kill 10 Jedi. Surprisingly, no one seemed to be struggling, certainly not as much as he was. Some of them seemed to be in minor discomfort, but no one seemed to be having as much trouble as him. It amazed him to know that, within a few days, the entire planet would be completely different. It was already barren, so there would be no change in vegetation, but the clash of the Jedi and the Bogan would wreck the entire spirit of this world. It would roll through like a ruinous wave, changing the very structure of the planet. He turned from watching his followers file out of the ship to the large expanse ahead of him. 4 kilometers in front of him it was only the endless savanna, nothing but flat plains full of twisted shrubs and dry, sharp grass. Even grass itself struggled to survive on this terrible moon. In the sky above him loomed Phant, the planet this tiny moon orbited. It was so close it made him feel like the two celestial bodies were always seconds away from a collision. No matter where he looked, the gray planet hung in the sky, casting a strange light on the moon. With a bit of imagination, Naaman could see the gigantic mountains jutting out from the not-so-distant planet's surface. For some unknown reason, Phant and all three moons orbiting it were made of the same hard, brittle material where almost nothing could grow. Apparently, beneath the stone, there was nothing but poisonous soil. The flat, dead plains gave way suddenly to a massive mountain range. Mountains as far as he could see to the right and left rose from the ground like jagged spears. The highest tips reached beyond the clouds and out of his view. On the other side of the massive mountain range was the Jedi camp. They had seen it in the distance when they had flown to their camp. They had been too far for him to tell how many of them there had been. He wanted to know before the battle joined who they had brought, if they had taken all the knights or only some. Had they left behind the Padawans or were they risking their youngest members to ensure victory? He needed to get a closer look at their operation. "Safe," he called out, turning back around. The lanky Gwalish bounded quickly towards him, always in a rush to say, "Rrr." He got to Naaman and stood straight at attention, almost rising to Naaman's height. "Yes, Lord Marshal." Naaman would miss his loyal second-in-command. "You and your elites will be the first to meet the Jedi. We saw their encampment when we came in, but I want you to get a closer look. Split them into their squads and have them travel over the mountains. If they meet any Jedi on the way, be sure they draw first blood." Seath nodded and ran back to his strike team to dole out orders. It would be interesting to see how the Jedi woman would deal with her new mission. Scene change. It felt so good and so strange to be on this planet, to be surrounded by the light side after being smothered by darkness for so long. She had grown so used to being inundated by the dark side she had stopped noticing it. It wasn't until now that she truly realized how thick it had been. She felt light as a feather as she ran with her squad towards the high mountains. She imagined, if she could see their faces, those around her would be twisted with discomfort. Within a few minutes of force-propelled sprinting, they reached the base of the mountains. Kinsa felt somehow less tired than when they had set out from their camp. Running in this atmosphere made her feel exhilarated. Her squad mates, however, didn't feel the same. They were all panting like people who couldn't get enough breath into their lungs. Without anyone saying anything, they all stopped for a couple of minutes before continuing on. The mountains up close seemed even more amazing than when they were far away. They rose up quickly out of view. If Kinsa hadn't seen them before, she would think it was just a sheer wall. Kinsa placed her hand on the side of the mountain and felt the sharp tiny stones protruding out from the otherwise flat rock. She looked over at Nathiera, wondering what they would do. She wasn't sure how they would get over these mountains. They couldn't climb straight up, especially not with these stones cutting into their hands. Nathiera looked up at the mountain and Kinsa saw her come to the same conclusion as her. "We have some more running to do. This mountain has to have a break in it somewhere. Let's find it." Their leader ignored the groans of protest and ran along the wall of the mountain. 5 minutes of running later, they came to a clear break in the mountain, almost a path. They filed in, forced to go one by one because of the tight, sharp corridors. After only a few steps, they had to get down on their hands and knees to crawl up the steep path. Kinsa was stuck behind Fulad. The broad-shouldered Selenian was constantly stopping and squirming around to fit through particularly tight spots, sending a shower of small stones rolling back to Kinsa. The longer they walked, the more Kinsa began to believe this was a man-made path. It was too straight and too continuous for it to be a natural occurrence. She assumed it was created by the original settlers years ago to pass through the mountains. She wondered how many of these there were. It wouldn't have made much sense for them to waste time and resources making too many paths. The other squads of elites would have a hard time getting through if she was right. Fulad's movements set off another slide of dirt and stones, bringing her away from her thoughts as she closed her eyes to keep the dust out. This was terrible. She had dozens upon dozens of tiny cuts in her skin from scraping it against the mountain. Somehow, these stones always seemed to slice through her thick robes and pierce her skin. The sharp grass had made its way into her boots, and making her itch to no end. It was one thing when she was running and adrenaline was pumping, but the slow trudging, waiting for the person ahead of her, was infuriating. Just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the path leveled out, letting her stand up straight. Her stiff spine ached as she stood up straight and bent backwards to stretch her back out. Luckily for her, the original inhabitants of this moon had carved a path up one of the smaller mountains. Even from where she was, she couldn't see the tops of the highest mountains around her. As the rest of them continued to stretch their weary backs, Kinsa looked at the scenery around them. From her spot at the top of the mountains, she could see both the Jedi camp and the Bogan camp. She laughed quietly under her breath. Here she was, stuck between them, as if the universe had to spell it out for her. Even from way up here, she could see the differences between them. The Bogan wore red robes and the tiny dots that made up the Bogan were a dark red, while the dots milling around in the Jedi camp were an earth brown. The Jedi ships, placed to the back of their camp, were a brilliant, gleaming white with a golden emblem of the Jedi Order displayed proudly. The Bogan ships were all painted a simple black. No emblems or markings, just black. After a short rest, they started their trek down the mountain. This time, Kinsa was glad she was near the back. They all had to lean back as they walked down, and, every once in a while, someone would slide for a moment and sent the sharp stones bouncing down the mountain towards everyone ahead of them. It took a long time, but they finally got to the other side of the mountains. Her hands were covered in tiny red streaks and had dozens of microscopic stones embedded in them. She started to pick them out, but stopped when she felt something she hadn't felt in what seemed like a long time: the light side. Not the simple light-sidedness of the atmosphere, but real Jedi. She was so surprised by the feelings, she stopped suddenly and jerked up, causing Nathiera to take notice of her. Nathiera stopped fixating on herself and she focused on her surrounding. She too noticed the presence of the Jedi. Nathiera looked to Kinsa and nodded her acknowledgement and thanks. Kinsa kicked herself. She wasn't actually supposed to help them. Nathiera noiselessly signaled her troops to stay silent. She started to move away from the mountains and the rest of the squad followed after her. Nathiera suddenly held up her hand in a fist, signaling them all to stop. Kinsa stared forward and saw a small grouping of Jedi a kilometer or so away. There's not too many of them. This will be our first strike against the Jedi, the masked woman whispered. Nathiera followed up her short speech by breaking into a run, covering amazing ground, using the Force to propel her onward. The rest of the squad, including Kinsa, followed after her. She saw the Jedi notice the running group. They ignited their lightsabers and started sprinting towards them. Kinsa gathered her force as she ran, holding it inside her as they neared the Jedi. Her heart thumped within her throat, and not from the running. This was the moment she'd always known was coming, but she had been pushing it aside, ignoring it for months. She realized she honestly didn't know what she was going to do in this moment. In her mind, she had always been telling herself that of course she would fight for the Jedi and destroy the Dark Cult, but, in her heart, she was harboring doubt. She had been with the Jedi for practically her entire life, yet she had never gotten to know anyone like she had with these people in only a few months. They may not share her beliefs, but they cared for her, and she cared for them. Some of them may annoy her from time to time, but right now that didn't matter. They were her squad. There were only 15 or so Jedi and 20 of them. Even if these were all masters, Kinsa knew they could beat them. But then what? They couldn't win the whole war, and she didn't want them to. She didn't want the Bogan to win. She just didn't want these people to die. They were close enough now to see the faces of the Jedi running at them. Their stoic looks were so different from the growls and yells coming from the beings surrounding her. The one at the head of the Jedi was an Asian man with short black hair and a determined look on his face. He held a yellow lightsaber in his hand, signifying him as a Jedi Sentinel. For whatever reason, that clinched it for her. She couldn't even consider betraying the Jedi in that moment. She looked at her squad sprinting beside her, recognizing all of them even with their masks on. She hated herself. Kinsa let go of the force she had been gathering within herself just as the elites were getting ready to launch forward at the Jedi. It released in a wave of energy and spread out like a bomb, pushing the men and women around her. Ready to make an offensive maneuver, they were all unprepared to defend against a force attack, especially one from within their own ranks. They were lifted up and pushed away from her, not one of them landing back on their feet. The Jedi immediately slowed, unsure of what to make of this strange development. Kinsa reached under her chin and ripped her mask off. She brushed aside a foolish feeling of sadness as she shed her face. "I am Jedi Knight Kinsa Una," she yelled quickly at the Jedi as the Bogan around her slowly started to recover from her attack. The sentinel at the head of the group nodded and continued his run forward. The rest of the Jedi followed quickly after him, meeting the cultists just as they got to their feet. Kinsa stood still, surrounded by the slaughter of her closest friends, unable to move. Nancy Eel didn't even get to her feet before a lightsaber drove into her chest, forcing her back to the ground. No's mask had been blasted off in her initial force blast. She stared into his face as a Jedi bent low and chopped off his legs before running on to his next victim, leaving the older Zabrak to bleed out. Fundle managed to get to her feet before the Jedi descended upon her. She swung in a wide arc, surprising the Jedi with her range, clipping two of them in the stomach as they charged at her. Before she could move forward to finish off the wounded warriors, a pale green lightsaber pierced through her chest. A Jedi had gotten behind her and had run her through from the back. She fell to her knees and Kinsa watched as her head was locked with her gigantic body. To her left, Kinsa heard the distinct sound of Jirja's light whip igniting. She spun around to see him surrounded by a group of Jedi as he spun constantly, jumping on the balls of his feet and flailing his weapon about wildly. Every time a Jedi thought they saw No penning and rushed forward, they caught a face full of his whip. In a few seconds, he had almost half a dozen bodies laid out in a ring around him. With each Jedi the whip hit, Kinsa felt a part of her die. She almost wished someone would kill him to stop him from this. She was certain if she could see beneath his mask she wouldn't see his beautiful innocent smile. Without warning, a Jedi leaped up, descending on him from above. Jirja brought his whip up to get the man and another Jedi on the GR. Aoun hurled his lightsaber at the small, spindly young man. Kinsa watched as it sailed forward and cut a huge gash in his stomach. Kinsa almost collapsed to the ground as a pitiful wail erupted from behind his mask. The terrible sound was cut short when the Jedi from above crashed down on him. Even outnumbered, the Jedi had easily won the short battle, losing less than a third of their members while cutting down the disorientated mob with what seemed like fevered excitement. The battle ended. Kinsa spun slowly to view the full scope of her betrayal. The Jedi were standing over the misshapen bodies of the people she had spent every waking moment with for the past 2.5 months. The Jedi had left no survivors. How? She heard a raspy, pained voice at her feet. She looked down to see Nathier lying at her feet, looking up at her with a terrible, confused look on her face. She had a stab wound in her gut and her mask had been slashed off, leaving the dark burn across her beautiful face. How? She repeated in a soft, fading voice. She grabbed onto Kinsa's ankle, her grasp weak. A painful lump formed in Kinsa's throat, stopping her from responding. She stared down, locked onto the woman's bleeding eyes. A blue streak interrupted the painful moment, cutting into Nathier's throat. Her eyes went wide and her mouth opened in a silent moan of pain. Kinsa felt her hand squeeze tightly around her ankle before going completely limp. Her head lolled to the side and rested softly on Kinsa's feet. Kinsa knew as the woman died that this was her last friend in the galaxy. Sithrat was still breathing, a rough angry voice growled from beside her. She ripped her eyes from the dead woman at her feet and glared at the man. The smug, proud look on his face dropped as her stare bored into him. It took strength she didn't know she had not to reach out and snap his neck. Jedi Knight Kinsa Una, came a voice from behind her. It's an honor to meet you. She slowly turned around, her anger slipping away into self-loathing and guilt. The sentinel who'd led the charge held his hand outstretched towards her. The council told us to keep an eye out for you. You've done amazing work. Name's Rish. Kinsa looked again at the bodies strewn about like a ring encasing her. Amazing work indeed. She stared at the man's outstretched hand and forced herself to shake it. Honor's all mine, sir, she croaked, her voice no doubt betraying her true emotions. I'd appreciate it if you could take me back to the council, she told him, speaking quickly, trying to cover up for her strange behavior. I'd like to give them a more detailed report. The man nodded. As soon as we collect their weapons and supplies, I'd be happy to escort you back. As the rest of the Jedi started picking everything useful off the dead bodies, Kinsa couldn't help but glance back down at Nathier's empty, accusing face. Scene change. We should strike now, before they realize none of their squads is missing. A Jedi Knight called out after Kinsa and Rish had told their story. The crowd fell silent. They looked to the council members for their response to the man's outburst. The council members looked to Master Sifu and Master Liftling. They were the most respected of the council members and they were usually on opposite sides of an issue. I think I agree, Master Sifu said. This is the time for action. We have a responsibility to the people of the Republic to protect them from this threat. We were given our gifts and our training for a purpose, for a day just like this one. The crowd of Jedi around Kinsa was nodding in agreement. People were calling out shouts of agreement. Kinsa, stuck in the middle of it, felt none of the inspiration or pride she knew she should be feeling. She was back in the brown robes of a Jedi, though her skin was still the same color, but she felt like she was wearing a disguise now, more so than when she'd been among the Bog, and she felt hard inside. She felt cold. She knew she had made the right choice. There was no doubt about it. Despite her personal feelings, the Bogan were evil. Her making a connection with a handful of them wouldn't change that. No matter how much she knew that in her head, she still couldn't stop seeing Nathira's scared, confused face and hearing Jirja's dying screams. These Jedi around her, she didn't know even one of them as well as she had known anyone from her squad, and they didn't care. Now her. They just didn't care. You can't have care or love if you stuff all your emotions into a small box. Kinzer was ready to fight, but not for the Jedi. She was ready to fight for the galaxy and for herself, just to give her something to distract her from the painful images floating around in her head. Scene change. Lord Marshal, one of our squads didn't return from our scouting mission. Only 2 besides them were able to make it over the mountains. The other 3 couldn't find a way to climb up and were forced to turn back. And what happened to the 2 who made it over the range? Naman asked. He honestly hadn't been expecting Kinz's squad to return. My squad met with another Jedi scout patrol. We were able to defeat the Jedi, but we lost 5 of our soldiers. The last squad made it to the Jedi camp without being interrupted. The Jedi are preparing to march to our camp for an attack. I suggest we prepare for them to come. We should wait here, let them tire themselves out, crossing the mountain before they face us. It seems this is where we will meet them. This was a problematic development. Naman had been planning to move his army over the mountain and have the battle there. That way, he could observe from the top of the mountain range, then sneak back here and leave on his ship without being noticed. No, we don't want them to know where we are. We can assume they also have scouts that have seen us. We will need the element of surprise in this battle. This is what we'll do, he said, coming up with the plan quickly. Get all the troops back into the ships. We're going to hang high in the atmosphere to avoid being seen or sensed. Once the entire Jedi army arrives at the base of the mountains, we'll jump down and surprise them from above. Seath nodded excitedly as Naman spoke. Who will pilot the ships? He asked. I will fly my ship and you can choose the other pilots, Naman responded. Seath paused for a moment. Wouldn't it be better if you led T? He charged. He asked hesitantly. I appreciate your opinion, but I've made the decision, Naman said firmly. We need to hurry. If we don't get there fast enough, then the Jedi will have already started climbing the mountain. It would be nearly impossible to land down on the sharp mountain range, and the higher the Jedi get, the greater the chance of them seeing us as we fly overhead. Naman could see the hesitation in Seath's eyes beneath his bone mask. He kept silent and nodded. Turning toward the army to inform the troops of the new plan. Naman was confident that, despite his doubts, the man would carry out his orders. Seath was a loyal second in command and he'd follow Naman no matter what questions he may have. Star Wars. The Grey War. Chapter 19. This would be her second time climbing up the stupid mountain. She looked back to the hundreds of Jedi trudging along at an impossibly slow pace behind her. How could they make it over the mountain? Hay still only knew this one way through and they would take hours upon hours walking through. If they knew they were coming, the Bogan could just wait at the other side of the mountain and cut them down one by one as they came. As much as she may be annoyed with the Jedi, she knew she had to say something. Kinza scanned the crowd for Master Sifu. She had to tell them this plan wouldn't work. She didn't know what they would do, but this would take too long and get everyone killed. She gave up looking and brought her communicator out and hailed him. We shouldn't be the ones to travel over the mountain, she said, not waiting for a greeting. If we climb over, we will be tired and hurt before the fighting even begins. There were a few minutes of silence and Kinza thought that maybe he hadn't heard her. Okay, what do you suggest we do? Came his reply. I think we need to all wait at the base of the mountain. This is our best position to meet them. They may have higher ground, but they will have to bottleneck to get through the mountains. We should also send smaller groups out across the mountains in case they find another way over the mountain. Another long moment of silence before he responded. We're going to keep everyone together. We can't risk any scout groups being overwhelmed and lost. We need everyone. Kinza understood this reasoning. The Jedi needed their numbers to overcome the Bogan, and if they split up, they could be defeated. But if the Bogan found another way across the mountain, they would be able to take the Jedi completely by surprise. She considered saying something, but figured it was pointless. She had said her piece and it wasn't her responsibility to single-handedly save the Jedi. Besides, she could be completely wrong. Okay. Scene change. Naman hovered high above the Jedi, watching them through binoculars as they ran around like ants. He thought he had his ships high so that they couldn't be heard, seen or sensed by the Jedi. Once the entirety of the long line of slow-moving Jedi arrived at the base of the mountain, Naman would give the order to lower the ships and drop the troops. His followers would use the Force to protect themselves from the fall and surprise the Jedi. He wasn't certain all of them would be able to survive the fall, but that didn't matter. They were all going to die in the coming battle anyway. The pilots were supposed to fly to the mountains, then join the battle. Naman, however, would stay in the mountain and watch the battle unfold before going back to Argonar to report to Darth Cognus. His heart was beating quickly within his chest. This had taken so long and there had been many complications, but soon it would finally be done. It felt amazing to see all the small moving parts finally falling into place. Scene change. Finally, all the Jedi Masters, Knights and Padawans were gathered around the base of the mountain. Kinza couldn't help but thinking how much better it would have been to keep them at least somewhat separated. If the Bogan betrayed their agreement, they could easily bomb the Jedi out of existence. With all the Jedi bundled up like this, their backs to the mountain wall, they were sitting ducks. As she was trying to stop worrying about what she couldn't change, she heard the mechanical whirring of ships above her. She looked up, expecting to see bombs dropping, but saw something even worse. Dropping from the sky were hundreds upon hundreds of beings with their sabers drawn, descending quickly. A worried yell moved throughout the ranks of the Jedi like a wave as they all looked up and alerted those standing next to them. The noise of 1,000 lightsabers being ignited simultaneously rose from the Jedi. She stared up as a pair of black boots rushed down towards her, the person's robes lifted up and flapping in the wind. Kinza surrounded herself in the Force like a shield, preparing for the attack. She stepped to the side at the last possible second as the boot smashed into the ground where she had been standing. As the Bogan landed, the world seemed to explode around her. Clouds of dirt flew up and waves of force came at her from all directions. Stones caught into her skin, adding to the already numerous slivers of dry blood. She barely managed to keep her legs under her as the very ground seemed to shake beneath her feet. She couldn't see more than a foot in front of her. Dust from the dry ground had risen up and clouded her vision. A streak of red broke through the dust suddenly. She ducked under the lightsaber and stabbed forward, feeling her blade hit and hearing a pained grunt. Before she was attacked again, she gathered a small amount of force and released it, blowing the cloud dust away from her and giving her some vision of the battlefield. She was amazed to see the Jedi falling to the Bogan all around her. Their surprise had been complete. She jumped to her left, lightsaber extended and blocked a downward/AI meant for a stunned Jedi. She kicked the hooded man's leg and stabbed at his chest as he crumpled down. Kinza held her hand out to help the man up and felt something coming from behind her. She spun and simultaneously brought her lightsaber up, blocking a slash from an alien woman. She stabbed at the woman who spun, avoiding the strike and counterattacked, smashing Kinza in the face with her fist. Kinza stumbled back for a second before jumping forward, feigning another stab at the cultist Cheese T. The woman spun to the left, avoiding the strike in the same way, just as Kinza had expected. Kinza brought her right leg up, slamming her knee into the woman's stomach as she spun, forcing the breath from her lungs and folding her in half. Kinza brought her lightsaber up, slicing through the woman's upper chest. Kinza angrily turned to look for another enemy to defeat. Scene change. At first, Naman had been completely blinded by the cloud of dust that billowed up around the fighters. After only a few seconds, the disturbed earth settled and Naman was able to watch the battle unfold, surprised and slightly worried at the success of his plan. The Jedi were taken completely off guard and dozens of them were being quickly cut down by his followers. Everywhere he looked, they were hardly even putting up any kind of a fight. It was starting to seem that the war would be over before the majority of the Jedi actually got to their feet. Naman breathed a sigh of relief as, after a few minutes, the tide of the battle turned to the Jedi's favor. The Jedi recovered from their surprise. Their superior skill and training was bringing them to victory. The Jedi were banding together while the Bogan were spread out and fought alone. The Bogan were extremely overconfident from their early success, and they were fighting without looking around, failing to see just how many of them were quickly falling to the Jedi as they bounced back with a vengeance. Scene change. A blade screamed at Kinza's face and she heard a stream of lightning being shot at her back. She spun and ducked, avoiding the lightsaber and catching the lightning in her hands, containing the dangerous electricity in a sphere of force energy, keeping herself disconnected from it. As she controlled the electricity in her hands, she felt the dark power slipping from her grasp, felt the lightning feeding and awakening the darkness within her. She quickly turned back to the cultist who'd stabbed at her and released it before it could escape from the cage she was holding it in, the blast knocking him off his feet and scorching a large black hole in his chest. She jumped up from her crouch, flipping backwards over the bogan who'd launched the lightning at her. She yelled with anger while in the air above the woman, her force launching forward, traveling with the scream. The power behind the roar forced the woman into the ground, grinding her flesh and bones into a pulp. While still in the air, she took a moment to observe the scene around her, her pumping adrenaline letting her take in everything around her in the split second before she landed. She was happy to see that the Jedi had recovered and were starting to sweep across the battleground, cutting a line across the scattered bogan forces. From what she could see, they were utilizing the group fighting strategy. 2 Jedi would fight back to back, protecting each other, moving constantly through the field. Then, when 2 groups of Jedi crossed each other's paths, they would expand, fighting in a square, always with their backs to each other, always moving. Eventually, there were giant circles of Jedi facing their enemies, while being able to trust that their backs were protected. When a Jedi got injured, the circle stopped moving. They stayed still and continued fighting while another Jedi from the line fell back into the circle to tend to the wounded. If they couldn't be helped, the group of Jedi continued moving on, leaving the dead lighter behind. For whatever reason, it seemed the bogan had no clue that any of this was going on. They were simply fighting wildly on their own with no communications passing between their ranks, similar, she realized, to how she was fighting. She saw and processed this all in a flash while she hovered above the bogan woman she had demolished. She landed softly on her feet and immediately ducked to the left to avoid another lightsaber. She turned and slashed at the cultist's legs to find he was wielding 2 lightsabers. He blocked her low strike and brought his knee up into her face. Kinza cushioned her face with the force to protect herself, but the blow still knocked her onto her back. The man shot a stream of lightning at her as she lay on the floor. Kinza brought her legs up over her head and pushed off with her hands, flipping back and landing on her feet. The lightning burned a circle in the grass where she had been lying. The man threw a lightsaber at her street as she landed. She ducked quickly to avoid the lightsaber. However, her long lekku trailed behind her head as she ducked down, falling slower than the rest of her. The tip of her right lekku was charred off by the searing blade as it flew past her head. She screamed in pain and anger and brought her hands up to the man. Coursing dark purple lightning flew from her hands and arced towards the man. The burning tendrils lifted the man and bore into him. He yelled for a moment before disintegrating completely to ash. Her screams of pain continued, and so did her channeling lightning. It spread out, arcing to other bogan and even hitting a Jedi in front of her. She tried to stop it, but the pain continued fueling the lightning. She just couldn't control it. Her anger toward the Jedi who had slaughtered Nathiera, the anger she had tried to smother, rose up again, continuing to fuel the terrible fire. Despite everything going on around her, her mind flashed back to Nathiera's words. She was letting herself get taken over by the flood. She needed to control herself. She heard the screams of the people around her urging her to stop. Slowly, she got her emotions under control. She closed her anger off and stopped the flood of lightning. The combination of the pain from her lekku and her use of the lightning caused her to fall to the ground. She felt the blackness start to close in and she had to fight to stay conscious. Her vision slowly cleared and she saw a human Padawan standing before her, his small braid hanging over his shoulder. He stared at her, his face painted in shock and fear. She slowly got to one knee, her head rushed and she still couldn't stand up. A ring of Jedi surrounded her, fighting the bogan in a circle to protect her. She reached behind her and lightly grabbed at her head tail, pulling it forward to get a look at the damage. About a sixth of her left lekku was chopped off. The wound was mostly cauterized, but there was a small hole surrounded by black and burned flesh. Deep red blood mixed with clear brain fluid slowly drained out the hole. Luckily the lightsaber hadn't chopped off enough of the tendril to affect any of the brain matter held within. She'd heard stories of Twi'leks who had lost larger portions of their head tails and, as a result, had lost parts of their memory or had to relearn some basic motor functions. She slowly pushed herself to her feet, keeping her arms out to keep her balance. "What was that?" the Padawan asked the horror still stuck on his face. "Did you create that lightning?" Kinza sighed. She knew she wouldn't be able to explain this to a Padawan. Even if she could, she wasn't sure if she should explain something so dark and damaging to someone so young and innocent. "There's no time," she said quickly, her words slightly slurred, trying to brush off the Padawan's interest. "There's a war going on," she insisted. Kinza opened herself up. The dark side within her was once again buried deep. He remembered the words of Nathiera yet again. Ignoring the Padawan's pestering, she sifted through her emotions, passing by the memory of Nathira's pained looks and remembering instead the small moments of friendship she'd had with the woman. She used these emotions and took the light side in, breathing slowly and letting it calm her and block out the pain. The aching of her bones and the stinging of her small cuts slowly faded away. Her tired muscles were revitalized and her remaining anger dwindled out. She jumped up and over the ring of fighting Jedi, slashing down as she landed, cutting through the top of a fighting man's skull. The other Jedi formed up beside her, all of them making a circle and battling the Bogan together. Scene change. Naaman watched the battle, extremely pleased with the success of his plan. There were still about 800 Jedi standing, roaming around the battlefield cutting down or capturing the remaining Bogan. Naaman was surprised at how many of them refused to be taken captive. About half of the remaining cultists were choosing to fight to death rather than surrender. He had to admit he felt a pang of guilt when he saw Zeeth fall. His previous second-in-command had fought valiantly until the end. His lightsaber had flashed with amazing speed and precision, making it look as if he were fighting with two blades at once. He'd only fallen when half a dozen Jedi had surrounded him on all sides, having slain or captured all the other Bogan in his area a long time ago. Zeeth had died after a long standoff with multiple lightsabers plunged into his body. Naaman turned now and headed to his parked ship. He didn't want to be here when the Jedi finished the battle. They would scour the small moon for any sign of survivors and, if Kinsa was still alive, she would no doubt make sure he was killed. He reached his ship and started it back up. He looked back at the field that had become a successful, brutal slaughter. He shot his thrusters forward and cleared the atmosphere, leaving Quill, the Jedi, his followers and Naaman, Lord Marshal of the Bogan, behind. Scene change. Burned flesh. Kinsa had decided long ago that there was no smell in the entire galaxy worse than burned flesh. Nothing worse than the smell of unnaturally, artificially burned bodies. The quick burns of lightsabers and lightning created a smell that was distinctly different from flesh burns by fire, and it was terrible. It was always strange to Kinsa how little Ood there was after these battles. It reminded her of fighting with Republic troops during the war with the Sith. The blaster bolts and, in this case lightsabers, were so hot that they burned as they passed through a person's body, almost always cauterizing the wound. It didn't feel right to have so much death around her without the blood. Back on Nar Shaddaa, the gangs had carried vibro knives and swords as well as blaster pistols. Wars and skirmishes had flooded the streets with blood. The blood always smelled long before the authorities got around to clearing the bodies and cleaning the streets. Growing up, she had associated death with that smell, the smell of blood after it had been drained from the body. As gross as that smell was, she preferred it to the stronger, more present smell she had to deal with now. After the Republic's long campaign against the Sith army, this was the smell she now associated with war and death. It was strange now, standing in the middle of the unbelievable carnage, with no blood soaking the ground and the only smell being charred body tissue and skin. The Jedi had lost more than 400 men and women in the short but brutal Battle of Quill. Their losses had been great, but they had been nothing compared to the Bogans. They had completely devastated the cult. They had killed about 900 cultists and had captured over 300. Once the battle was clearly in the Jedi's favor, many of them had thrown down their weapons and begged for peace. It disgusted her. These people planned for who knew how long to murder every single Jedi. They had cut down hundreds of young Padawans and other Jedi, but now they begged for mercy and were granted it. Would the Bogan have granted the Jedi clemency had they pleaded for it? She doubted so. She knew she should be happy with their victory, with the good the Jedi had done, but she still felt angry. She wasn't sure who she was most angry with, the Jedi or the Bogan or herself. She knew she was certainly angry with herself. She had almost killed a Jedi because she had lost control. The other reason Kinsa couldn't keep from being angry was they hadn't found Rogan among the dead or captured. No one she had talked to had seen anyone matching Rajan's description on the battlefield. According to the captured Bogan she had spoken to, Rogan had flown one of the drop ships. He was supposed to join them after they jumped down, but he hadn't been seen by any of them since the battle had been joined. Kinsa assumed he had just flown away after dropping the cultists off, but she couldn't understand why. What was the point of him fighting to be the leader of the cult and then attacking the Jedi if he was just going to leave them to die? If he didn't think they could have won, he could have just waited. If they trained and recruited in no time at all, they would have been able to defeat the Jedi. It seemed like Rogan hadn't wanted to defeat the Jedi, but just wanted to create a scenario where the Jedi had killed all the members of this previously hidden cult. She should have just tried to kill him in his tent when she'd had the chance back on Jagada. As angry as she was about letting him get away, Kinsa felt her path had crossed with Rajans for a reason, and she was certain she hadn't seen the last of him. The next time she met him, she would make sure it was the last. Scene change. Darth Millennial levitated slowly down to his students where they stood in the courtyard. They looked up at him and cheered, of course elated by his return. This was exactly the same place they had been when he left almost a week ago. They'd probably been waiting out here, watching for his return. It made sense, of course. While he was there, they thought they would be fine without him, but as soon as he left, they realized they couldn't live without him. If he didn't keep stores of food and water in the temple, they almost certainly would have died by now. As he landed softly on the stone floor, his followers looked up at him, exchanging hushed nervous whispers. No doubt about how foolish they had been to doubt and conspire against someone with such mastery over the Force. They sensed the strength that had been granted him by the mask of Darth Sanders. They couldn't have been the ones projecting the monster into his mind, he decided in that moment. He was much too powerful for that. Even with their combined power, they never could have pierced through his impenetrable mind. It must have been a true vision from the Force, as he had previously thought. His followers had just tried to capitalize on what they foolishly saw as a weakness. No more would he be haunted by the ominous vision of the coming monster. He now welcomed the chance to obliterate the foolish alien. Scene change. Darth Cognews sat at her massive computer, sorting through her messages, putting together a picture of the outside world based on the words of her spies. She blew out a sigh of Bo-Redu as she stared at the screen, not really seeing or registering the words in front of her. She was honestly amazed at herself. For her entire life she had enjoyed, even required, her solitude. Then when she had joined the Sith, having a master, then an apprentice had been more of an annoyance than anything else. When she had sent away Naman, she assumed she would be relieved to be alone once again, but after finishing off Set Harith, she had grown bored. She wondered what she had done during her time alone after Darth Millennial to keep herself occupied, but couldn't remember. She had no immediate projects and so had spent the last month and a bit just training against enemies she herself created, racking her brain for something to do. She perked up suddenly as a soft beeping alerted her to the presence of a ship coming in to land on the property. She switched windows so the computer was displaying the outside cameras and saw that it was indeed Naman coming in to land in the old transport ship. She stood up from her seat and walked quickly towards the hangar. As she got to the ship, starting its landing and cool-down procedures, she dropped her slight smile, trading it in for a more stern look. With a pop and a hiss, the ramp lowered and Naman stepped down, his sword strapped to his back. He looked even taller than she remembered. She chalked it up to more refined and pungent force she felt as she walked up to him. Clearly he hadn't been slacking over these past few months. The Y stood for a few seconds before Naman dropped to one knee. The cult is destroyed. They're all either dead or in Jedi custody. I'm sure they'll end up on a prison planet. The Jedi lost a few hundred, well, he told her, his head bowed. She nodded. You did well. You can get cleaned up and I'd like to hear about it all in more detail. Naman rose to his feet, once again towering over her. Thank you, Master. It's good to be back. Good to have you back, she replied honestly before turning away, walking back to her study. Star Wars. The Grey War. Chapter 20. Thank you, Cognews told the small, nervous radiant flickering blue on her holocommunicator. You will be rewarded. She clicked off her communicator and dropped her heavy hood down. She leaned back in the oversized chair in her study, contemplating this new information. She had just been informed by one of her many eyes and ears in the Republic that there was a Jedi Master going from planet to planet, dismantling dark side cults and, more importantly, asking about a towering, black-scaled barbell named Rogan. Cognews of course knew about these Jedi Shadows, as they called themselves. The last whispers of a once formidable order, in her opinion the only real Jedi left, who hunted down what they thought were the last echoes of a once great empire. She had to admit that the feats of this Master Kinsa Un impressed her, even taking into account the habit of exaggerating the Rodian criminal she employed. She was still amazed at the number of and the size of the cults she'd completely wiped out. While the rest of the Jedi were relaxing, even the most adventurous of them giving themselves what they believed to be a well-deserved rest, it seemed this woman had only become more active after the Battle of Quill. She mulled it over for a few more minutes, her fingers tracing the ancient, worn script carved into her stone chair. The strands began to weave together in her mind. connecting slowly to form a plan. She rubbed harder and deeper at the grooves by her hand. Over the years of making her plans in this chair, the words on her armrest were now significantly less visible than the rest of the words on the chair. Darth Cognus had always planned to send her apprentice to Dromund Kaas to dispose of Darth Millennial, partially because she wanted to be rid of him, but mostly as a test for Namon. However, there had never been a time that it made sense. Before he received his sword, he was so sloppy with his combat he wouldn't have stood a chance. Once he'd gotten it, she'd been training him with the weapon. Then, by the time he was proficient with it, he had been busy dealing with the cult on Dragutta, and now, based on the skills of her old apprentice, it would be no real challenge for Namon. His mastery over the Force had always been amazing, and now he had considerable skill with his new weapon. It just didn't make sense sending him on a mission she knew he couldn't fail. However, things had changed. With this Jedi in the mix, things would be much more uncertain. It would be utter chaos, and only a master of all aspects of the Force could hope to survive. With the addition of the light side warrior, it would be about more than martial strength. It would be a perfect test for her up-and-coming apprentice. She pulled her hood over her head again to obscure her face. She would call her contact and get him to whisper in the Jedi's ear rumors of Namon on Dromund Kaas. Then she would train with Namon one last time and try to iron out any major weaknesses. She wanted this to test him, but she also wanted him to survive. It would be such a bother finding another apprentice, and, she admitted to herself, she quite liked this one. Scene change. Jedi Master Kinsa Una stared at herself in the mirror, amazed at the change in herself. She reminded herself of the disguise she had worn almost a year ago. Her face was littered with small scars, and her once soft, bright eyes seemed physically darker. They held the hardness of someone who had seen and caused too much death. Her face seemed shrunken in, sharper and bonier than it had been. The tip of her right leg had been replaced with a piece of lightweight metal. She'd traded in her traditional brown Jedi robes for high leather boots, flexible spandex pants, and a loose cotton shirt. These clothes let her blend in and get into places where Jedi weren't welcome. She'd also found the oversized, billowing robe to be somewhat of a hazard when in battle. This was simply more practical. The greatest change, however, couldn't be seen in the mirror. She had grown colder. When she had started going on missions again, she had planned to use her light side emotions, but it had been harder than she'd thought. There were so few of her emotions that were purely good. Even the ones that inspired the light side had negative emotions attached to them as well. So, every time she manipulated her emotions for her needs, a twinge of darkness came along with it. Over time, that small amount built up to the point where all her emotions, all her memories were just gray and dull. She still didn't regret the path she had chosen. She was proud of the difference she had made in the galaxy despite the price she had paid. While she was proud of what she had done, she had only grown more bitter and disappointed in the Jedi. For some reason, she had thought after the war it would be different, that they would be invigorated, that the Council would see the danger in staying away from the rest of the galaxy and would send more people out, that more people would want to go. If anything, it had become even worse than it was before. Now the younger Jedi who, before, had been arguing that the Jedi should be more effective and threatening to separate, were just as content to sit around as the older members of the Order. 8 months ago, she had been called back to Coruscant to be granted the title of Jedi Master. She was younger than most Masters, but, after her role in the War of Quill and her clear devotion to the Force and to the galaxy, the Council chose to bestow the honor upon her. When she was back, she'd had to focus to keep from feeling angry or jealous at the Jedi she'd seen walking around her. They wore smiling, joyful faces, as if they had all forgotten the devastating war only a few months ago, as if they had forgotten how easily darkness could rise up in secret. They were all blissful, unaware of the sacrifices she and others like her had made. On the way to the Council chambers, she had seen another Jedi. His scarred, pitted face displayed the emotions she felt, a sharp contrast to the clueless, happy expressions of the other Jedi. She could see from his outfit, Jedi robes over top a plain shirt with plates of armor woven into and behind the cloth, that he was a sentinel. His uniform was worn and overused, standing out from the crisp, fresh robes of the other Jedi. As they passed, their eyes met for a moment, and Kinsa knew he was no ordinary sentinel. She saw the hard look in his eyes and the weariness hidden behind his grim, determined face. In the sea of light, she had felt the gray inside him, slightly tainted by the things he had done. As they looked into each other's eyes, Kinsa felt the man reaching out to her, and she had tried to reach out and comfort him. It had been such a short moment, but it had meant so much. In those few seconds of contact, she had felt understanding, sympathy, and encouragement. and she had done her best to make him feel the same. It helped her get through the low times, reminded her that there were others out there like her, all doing their part. She accepted the possibility that it had just been a glance and her mind had filled in the rest out of necessity, but in her heart she knew it was more than that. When she got into the council room, she had gone through the big long ceremony. When she was a Padawan, all she could ever think about was becoming a Jedi Master, but now it didn't even excite her. She saw it was just a title. Nothing changed. She didn't magically become a better fighter, nor was she granted instant knowledge. She would still be going out and doing the same thing she had been doing before. After she received the title, she had spoken in private with Master Sifu, the closest thing she had left to a friend. Then she was still optimistic about her new ideas of the light side and the dark. She told him how when the Jedi blocked up all their emotions, even their good ones, it made them weak. She'd expected the council, and even Master Sifu, to be hesitant in listening to her opinions, but she was still shocked when he shot her down completely. He told her that it was impossible to block out only some emotions. It was either all or nothing. Looking back now, she still wasn't sure she agreed with him. She understood his hesitation more now than she did then, but she still thought that it could work. Just because she hadn't solved it completely, she still thought that if all the Jedi worked on it together, they could figure it out. Kinza had left the Jedi Temple that day and hadn't been back. If she was being honest with herself, she no longer even considered herself a Jedi. She had no connection to any other Jedi, and she disagreed with them on so many things. She didn't even have contact with anyone anymore. Before the war, she used to talk to Master Sifu and a few Jedi Knights she had grown somewhat close to on her holo-communicator while she was out in the field between missions. Now, she only talked to other Jedi when receiving assignments from the Shadow Council. Even that was slowly dropping off. Being so entrenched in the world of Darkside, she often found rumors of activity on her own before the Council did and went to investigate by herself without informing anyone. Another thing that had dropped off was her check-ins. It was supposed to be necessary for J.E.D. Shadows to check in with the Shadow Council and the Jedi Council, to catch them up on their progress and to talk about how everything was affecting them. You were never supposed to go more than one standard month without a check-in. It had been 5 months since her last one. The first time she missed it, she was undercover and wasn't in a position to call back to Coruscant. She'd expected there to be messages asking where she was and why she hadn't checked in, but once she was done dealing with the cult, she checked her communicator and there was nothing. Not one message from any of her superiors asking why she'd missed check-in. They just didn't care. So, if they didn't care, she figured what was the point wasting her time. As each month passed by, she was less and less surprised when she didn't get a call, and a bit more disappointed. Even though she told herself she didn't care, she knew it wasn't true. She felt like she had been forgotten, like she was just an expendable soul, deer who had been thrown haphazardly at a broken galaxy. No matter how much she reminded herself that she had chosen this life for herself, she still felt betrayed by the Jedi. It was petty, childish and selfish, but she felt that, for everything she was doing, she deserved to be remembered and cared for. Despite all the work she was doing, all the dark artifacts she had destroyed and all the cults she had dismantled, part of her still felt like she was failing. She'd felt the darkness in the galaxy and she felt like she hadn't even scratched the surface. Besides, no matter what she did, Rogan was still out there. On every planet she landed on, she asked about the monstrous, scaled force user named Rogan, but she hadn't heard anything about him. He seemed to have disappeared completely. She turned from the mirror and looked at her navigation computer. According to her instruments, it would be about 2 more hours and she would be coming up on Trill. She turned from the cockpit to her small bunk. She knew she should try to get a bit of sleep before she got there. A week ago, just before she was about to ask the Shadow Council for another mission, she had been contacted by a mysterious Rodian about information. He had refused to talk over communicator, so now she was heading there to speak to him in person. Scene change. Naman held his sword low, his right hand near the pommel, the tip just centimeters from the ground. He faced his master and planned his first strike. Ever since his mission with the Bogan, he had specialized his combat. On offense, he utilized a heavily modified version of Form 5 combat, Gemso, with mixes of Form 7, Hueo. It focused on heavy blows rather than quick stabs, letting the blade build momentum, escalating the speed and strength of the strikes as the fight went on until his opponent could no longer keep up. He also used many unarmed attacks on offense, using his barbell training, his rock-hard scales and sharp claws to devastating effect. On defense, He fell into a cross of Form 3, Sorezu and an unarmed combat style he had developed. Because his sword was heavier and therefore slower than a lightsaber, it was impossible for him to keep up on defense with an equally skilled opponent. He had been practicing using the Force to keep lightsabers at bay, using a mix of the Force and his thick scales to protect him. He'd gotten much better at it since the assassination attempt on Jagata. Now he could take a direct stab or slash from a lightsaber and come away with nothing but a light burn. He could leave a clear opening for an opponent so that, when they struck, expecting to slice or cut through him, he could capitalize on their surprise and poor position to secure victory. As he stood facing Darth Cognus, he rifled through his memories and brought up the sadness he had felt when he'd seen Zeeth die. The sad emotion started up and he transformed it into rage. Rage at the Jedi for killing him, at himself for letting it happen, and at Darth Cognus before him who had masterminded the entire thing. He then used his anger to gather power within and he fed his blade, letting it drink deeply in his massive pool of dark side energy before amplifying it and pouring more back into him. The vicious cycle continued until his pool was overflowing with dark energy and he could no longer contain it. He raised his hand and released a single thin bolt of electricity aimed at his master. Rather than bat it away or orb lightning, she jumped over it, sailing well over the bolt and closing the distance between them. Naman waited as his master descended down on him and he swung his blade up to meet her. Expecting his attack, she tucked her knees up to her chest, letting the sword pass harmlessly underneath her. She continued forward and landed with her legs still bent atop his broad chest in a crouch, and slashed with one of her shadows at his face. Naman stood firm under the light weight of his master and he slightly twisted his head back to dodge her attack. Before he could retaliate, Darth Cognus pushed off his chest and flipped herself backwards. As she flew through the air, she pressed the secondary activator on her lightsaber, causing it to snap into a tonfa shape running parallel with her forearm. Before she landed, she ignited her second lightsaber and threw it at him. Naman saw his master's bright blue lightsaber flipping towards him. He ducked out of the way and, before the short lightsaber cold returned to her, he absorbed power from Pyasik Darafan and released a wide wave of energy at his master. The blast of energy, invisible to the eye but plainly visible to Naman, traveled quickly across the room. Darth Cognus had her force shield up and was able to absorb the brunt of the blow. What remained of the attack was still sufficient to launch her backwards a couple of meters and onto her back. It broke her telekinetic hold on the lightsaber. He heard it extinguish and clatter to the ground behind him. Scene change. The air was quickly forced from her lungs as Cognus smashed onto her back. Ignoring her body's pleas for a moment of rest, she sprung back to her feet. She looked up to see Naman flying at her, his sword raised high above his head. She stepped to the side as he landed, avoiding his sword rather than attempting to block the devastating blow. Surprisingly, he was able to change the direction of his blade before it hit the floor, wrenching it to the side, slashing G sideways at her legs. She jumped up to avoid the blade, hearing it swish as it sped past her feet. Almost as soon as she landed, she had to squat low to avoid another two-handed slash aimed at her chest. This continued on, her ducking and weaving to avoid his attacks. To the untrained eye, it would look like she was controlling the fight, teasing him as she easily dodged his strikes but able to end it at any time she wanted. This wasn't the truth. While she was successfully avoiding his flying G blade, this was truly to Naman's advantage. The more she dodged, the more momentum would be built, until eventually he would be moving too fast for her to dodge. She couldn't simply block, because the strength of his attacks would force her to take a moment to recover, a moment she didn't have. She couldn't attack him because, with only one saber, she would have no defense if she missed or if he managed to absorb a blow, as he had surprised her with many times in the past. She knew it was hard work for him to keep this up, continually changing the direction of the blade, but she also knew she couldn't count on the towering man to tire. This seeming lack of options didn't cause her any worry. As an assassin, she had prided herself on quick thinking and ingenuity, always having something up her sleeve. Her arsenal of tricks had grown exponentially since becoming a Sith. Her apprentice had become an impressive martial force, but he was still no match for her. Scene change. On the downward diagonal cut, Darth Cognus suddenly brought her guard Shoto up to block, bringing her other hand up to grab her Cortosi's laced gauntlet to support her defenses. As his sword came crashing down on her defenses, she was still forced to one knee from the weight behind the blow. Naman, however, was too surprised at her sudden change of tactics to seize his momentary advantage. Darth Cognus pushed off with her right leg, moving inside Naman's sword and letting it fall behind her. As she stepped inside of his guard, she placed her hand on his chest and used the force to push him backwards. He was lifted off his feet and pushed a couple of meters away from her. He managed to land back on his feet, skidding backwards for a few seconds before coming to a stop. "You need to pay more attention," she told him as they both caught their breath, her words dripping with condescension. "You can't fall into a routine that your opponent can start to predict. You need to be ready to change at a moment's notice. I gave you the perfect opportunity and you failed to act. If you're ever going to become leader of the Sith, you need to learn to seize every opportunity put before you." Scene change. As she spoke, Cognu subtly used the force to inflame her apprentice's emotions. Namon's only response was a hissing growl as he charged at her, just as she'd planned. She stood still as he charged at her, still gathering a small amount of force, waiting until he got close enough for her attack to be effective. He lifted his sword high just as Cognu released her stored force in a brilliant explosion. Not an explosion of physical energy, but of brilliant, white light. She shut her eyes tightly and could still see the burning light, shining red through her eyelids. Scene change. As long as he had lived in this world of daylight, Namon's eyes had never fully adjusted from the blackness of his homeworld. Darth Cognu's light attack was devastating. It felt like the light had already burned off his eyes and was reaching further in, trying to scorch his brain. It reminded him of his first morning on Alcaro, but so much worse. Eventually, spots of vision began forming in his world of white, and he was confident he wasn't truly blinded. He couldn't even think about fighting during this time, and he wondered why his master hadn't ended it already. His vision finally returned, and he could see her fuzzy form, arms crossed and lightsaber hilt hanging from her belt. He stared at her until her blurry image returned to normal. Looking at her now, something seemed off, a tiny nagging that he refused to hear. He ignored his slight paranoia and strode towards her. Moving slowly and steadily, he let his anger build as he moved, empowering Kashyyyk Darufan and himself. He was determined to end her, this embodiment of arrogance. There was a time when he would have been angry at her for using such tricks, but now he saw how foolish that had been. A true warrior only has one word in his code: win. He applauded his master's tactics. She had played to her strengths and exploited his weakness. He was infuriated with her because she had patronized him, dragging out the fight for his benefit, so confident in her victory, as if he was a toy to be played with or a child that a parent was coddling when they had no chance. He exploded into action suddenly, dashing forward and swiping with his left hand at her face, reaching for her with his razor-sharp claws extended. She quickly lay back and managed to avoid his grasp. He followed up immediately by heaving his sword upwards, aiming to split her in half. Darth Cognu simply continued leaning back and pushed off with her legs, and flipping onto her hands, avoiding the blade before completing the flip and landing back on her feet. She grabbed her lightsaber from her belt and ignited it, using it as a regular Shoto rather than a saber tonfa. Again, he felt something wrong. Again he pushed it away. Scene change. Cognu watched, holding onto one of the support beams as Namon battled her illusion. Maintaining this illusion at the same time as hiding her forced signature was relatively simple, especially against someone as distracted as her apprentice. She had the ability to create solid illusions, who could be touched and do real physical damage, but they were significantly more complicated. It was also something she wanted to keep from Namon. She needed some secrets to reveal beyond the day her apprentice Chaleng ed her. Instead, she had created a phantom, capable only of wielding an already existing lightsaber. If Namon or his weapon actually touched it, it would pass right through and the illusion would fade away. Scene change. Fueled by his righteous anger, Namon was moving faster than he'd ever moved before. His sword drank in his anger and led his attacks. It felt as if the blade was swinging, moving his arms along, instead of the other way around. Slowly but surely, he felt himself gaining the advantage. His master was tiring and slowing, and he was only speeding up as his rage and his momentum steadily grew. He felt the moment of victory coming upon him. As angry as he was no amateur fool. He wasn't blinded by his emotion. He knew it would be exceedingly stupid to kill her. He still had much to learn from her, and he knew he was nowhere near ready to become the sole Lord of the Sith. The focus of his training had this far mostly been in the aspects of combat and force mastery. He had no idea how to further the plans of the Sith, what plans his master had in motion or how to make plans of his own. So, as the final moment came, as he was slashing down on her and knew she was in no position to block or dodge, he aimed his blade for the outside of her shoulder rather than her head or neck. She would most likely lose all or part of her arm. It could be easily reconstructed and she could continue to teach him, but she would never dare to treat him like some underdeveloped child again. He would have smiled if he wasn't so preoccupied with his rage as his sword descended down upon her, his victory assured. He grew excited in anticipation of the feeling of cutting roughly through meat and bone. He could feel the hunger of Kaisik Darafun, wanting to be quenched by the blood of his master. But then nothing. His strike continued unimpeded and he almost fell forward, so off balance because of this unexpected turn of events. His shock multiplied when his master simply dissipated into mist and disappeared. He sensed something fall behind him and, with the snapness of an igniting lightsaber, it all fell into place. He felt the heat of a lightsaber millimeters from his spine and heard the dreaded words he had heard 1,001 times. "Done much," his master said behind him, no smugness or disappointment in her voice, simply stating a fact. "Take a seat," she told him, extinguishing the lightsaber at his back and recalling the other one from where it had fallen. "I have a lesson for you." Naman groaned inwardly. He knew he needed these lessons, but still he couldn't help but despise them. "And a mission," she said as she sat down on the hard floor. This brought Naman out of his slight depression. "Do you know why I beat you?" she asked once they'd gotten settled. "It's not because I'm a better fighter than you, though I am," she said with a smile without waiting for an answer. "You lost because of your pride. You saw yourself as too good to be dismissed by me and you focused solely on defeating me to teach me a lesson. If you had kept your pride in check and paid attention to your surroundings, you would have been able to see that what you were fighting was merely an illusion. I have taught you to abandon your honor, how the insects of the world, both present and future, see you, but you must also learn to dismiss your pride. That is how you see yourself. Pride more than anything else has been the unraveling of the galaxy's great saint beings. The moment you see yourself as too good for something or too great and mighty to be undone by someone is the moment before that thing or being destroys you." Nama nodded his head, soaking in the lesson. As much as he hated them, he could never doubt their usefulness. "And now," she said, her tone becoming slightly less serious, "for your mission." All thoughts of the lesson were shoved to the back of his mind at the mention of another assignment. "Do you know why you have not been granted the moniker of Darth?" she asked him. "No," he replied. "I thought perhaps you only received the title when you defeated your master, and so I would receive it when I defeated you." "If you defeat me," she replied with a grin. "But no. Normally you would have received the Darth title at the same time that you chose your new name, but I withheld it from you." Naman sat in stunned silence and tried to keep any emotions from showing on his face. Why would she do that? Did she think he wasn't good enough? He'd done everything she'd ever asked him to do and he'd done it all perfectly. Before he freaked out, he brought to mind his master's recent lesson and managed to keep his pride in check and not get angry. He knew there had to be an explanation. "As you know, you're not my first apprentice," she told him slowly, every word calm and measured. "My first was a human mutant, Darth Millennial. He was my apprentice for 4 years, but we disagreed on many things, chief among Darth Bane's rule of 2. He knew he could not defeat me but, refusing to remain under my tutelage, he fled to the ancient Sith world of Dromund Kaas. There he has set up a cult of followers, and there you will defeat him. Only when you have slain him, stripping him of his life and his title, will you be worthy to hold the title of Darth Naman." If he was surprised before, Naman was absolutely stunned now. So many emotions swirled around him and he was trying to sort it all out. Surprise at this new revelation, excitement over his new assignment, and a twinge of anger and betrayal that Darth Cognus had never said anything about the rules of the title before. Now, he would have gone after the old apprentice if he had known. After a minute of trying to work it out, Darth Cognus spoke up and interrupted him. "Any questions?" Naman had a few questions but he knew none of them were things Darth Cognus wanted to hear. "Only one. When do I leave?" Darth Cognus gave him one of her cruel smiles. Scene change. She loved it when a plan came together. Star Wars. The Grey War. Chapter 21. Master Kinsa stepped off her ship and was immediately assaulted by a small green Rodian speaking in heavily accented basic. "Master Jedi. You came. Thank you, thank you." No thank you," she responded, hoping this trip wouldn't be for nothing. Since becoming a shadow, she had received a dozen fey tips. "You told me you had some information for me?" "Yes. I know where your monster is." "Rogan?" The Barbell? She practically yelled, feeling excited for the first time in months. Yes, he is Andromon Kos. Kinza knew that name. If she remembered correctly, it was an ancient Sith planet. It had been the core world of the last great Sith Empire almost 2,000 years ago. After the Republic and Sith War ended, the Jedi had attempted to cleanse it of the dark side, but, as far as she knew, it remained largely unpopulated. It all makes sense for someone like Rogan to go there and hide. Do you know anything else? She hurriedly asked the tiny Rodian. No, sir. Just that he's working with some other bad one on Andromon Kos. Thank you, she told the man as she ran quickly back to her ship. She had to get there as soon as possible. She didn't want him to escape her again. She jumped into the pilot's chair and set a course for the Outer Rim territories. She wasn't sure where Andromon Kos was exactly, but she'd be able to find out by the time she got to that end of the galaxy. Scene change. Darth Millennial felt it coming. The Dark Monster's time was near. All he got when he opened himself to the Force was still the monster's figure, but somehow it felt more present. He couldn't explain it, but he knew it was coming. He exited his meditation chamber and looked over his flock. Even though he had lost some followers, he was still certain he had enough to overwhelm the false Sith, especially now that he had brought them under his will once again with his iron fist. Disciples of the Force, my children of the dark side, he addressed them, his commanding voice booming over the courtyard. Soon there comes a destroyer, an evil dark assassin bent on corrupting the Sith and destroying the new Brotherhood of Darkness. He looked down, pleased to see the faces of his followers etched in fear. But cease your worrying, for he is only one man and he stands no chance against our army. We prevail. Scene change. Naman shut the ship down and looked around to make sure he had everything. He grabbed his sword and strapped it along with the scabbard to the loop on his back. He grabbed his lightsaber and placed it on the belt around his waist. He hated the weapon, but he knew it had its uses. It could cut through almost anything, and if he was separated from Kashyyyk Arifan, it would be good for him to have it as backup. He grabbed his VDV-100 telecommunicator in case he needed to contact his master for anything. He opened the door to the ship and stepped onto the ground. His favorite part of his new life was this moment, when he took his first steps onto a new world. Every planet felt unique. Strange ground, new smells and the different force swirling around. He could feel the dark side here, but, after the living, pulsating force of Voras, being surrounded by his master's overwhelming force on Argonar and surrounded by the cultists on Jugutta, it felt stale and dead here. He heard STR and cracking above him and looked up into the sky. When he had flown to the planet, he had passed through a strange thick cloud, but he thought it was just an overcast night. Now, looking up, he saw it was some kind of unnatural coverage. The entire sky, as far as he could see, was covered with dark gray clouds filled with lightning. He didn't understand how a place that had clearly been so completely controlled by the dark side felt so dead to it now. He felt it here, but he couldn't draw into it. Even though he couldn't use the force around him, he could feel the darkness swirling around behind him, draining into Kashyyyk Arifan behind him. Darth Sima's sword truly lived up to his name. Scene change. As soon as she entered the atmosphere, Master Kinza felt the dark side pressing in on her, choking out her strength. Her ship rocked as it traveled through the dark storm clouds. She had many experiences with the dark side inhabiting the planets she visited, but she still hadn't got unused to the drastic shock of it when she entered the atmosphere. It always took her a few minutes to adjust to the sudden change. She knew that this planet had once been a Sith world and, clearly, the Jedi's attempts to cleanse it had failed. She wasn't surprised the Jedi had just given up when it didn't work. When she passed through the clouds, she craned her neck to look out the window back at them. The clouds looked somehow menacing and she assumed they had been somehow created by a darker Itul. This entire planet was just a testament to the Jedi's failure. As she searched for a place to land, she saw a blip on her radar. There was another ship nearby, close enough for her radar to pick it up. She brought her ship in low to check it out. The large, unmarked, black cargo ship was parked in a large clearing, so she brought her ship down beside it. She got up from her chair and moved to the back of the ship, grabbing her utility belt and strapping it on. Her belt had her lights up AR, restraining cuffs, medical stims and kolto shots, her stun baton and a few other things she had learned to carry as a Jedi Shadow. She left the ship and felt the dark side pushing back at her as she stepped forward, as if it was trying to force her back onto the ship. She pushed through the dark force around her, letting the light side within her expand outward to keep the dark crushing world at bay. She saw no one in the ship and, with the dark side clouding her slightly, she couldn't sense anything about the owner of the ship. When she looked around, however, she saw large, deep footprints in the mossy wet grass. It was a strange footprint, as big as a boot but with individual digits like a bare foot. Keenzo assumed these were Rajans, but that didn't make sense. If he was a part of the cult residing on this planet, why would there be such recent footprints, and where had he gone? And, even if he had left, why would he be landing out in the middle of nowhere, presumably kilometers from the temple? Whatever the reason, Rogan had left a set of clear tracks that would be easy to follow. Keenza checked to make sure she had everything and took off, jogging after Rogan. Scene change. Darth Millennial sat for one last time in his meditation chamber. He chanted under his breath in the ancient Sith language, trying to commune with the Force. He was preparing to open himself up to a vision. He needed to see something before the mysterious man came. He finished his chant and opened his third eye, trying to will the vision to rush into him. The room around him suddenly disappeared and he was floating around his outer courtyard. He flew closer to the floor and he saw something. A body in black, burned robes lying mangled on the stone floor, blood draining from its head into a pool on the gray ground. As he got closer, the body seemed to roll over on its back by itself and he saw his own face, bloody and broken, staring vacantly back at him. The vision snapped away and he returned to his meditation chamber, his black robe sticking to his body, drenched with sweat. An acolyte ran into the room and bowed quickly, panting from his rushed run up the stone steps. "Master, we've seen someone coming. He's only a few minutes away." Still reeling from his vision, Darth Millennial stood up slowly, his legs shaking beneath him. He stepped unsteadily out of his meditation chamber. He looked down on his disciple who was eyeing him strangely. He quickly stood straight and he got his body under control. He gave the acolyte a cold stare and walked past him down the stone steps. His disciples were all huddled close together in the courtyard. The apprentice squeezed past him as he ran down the stairs and blended into the throng. "Let him enter the fortress, and then we will crush him," he yelled, working to keep his voice from shaking and betraying his emotions. The vision continued to flash through his mind, haunting him. He felt the pulsating dark presence coming from the other side of the wall. It felt strange, like there were two separate but connected beings on the other side of the wall. He moved slowly so his group of disciples was between him and the strange Force signature on the other side of the wall. The group of 50 disciples milled about, whispering quietly and urgently. The older ones seemed to be giving some orders to the younger ones. Darth Millennial didn't care what they were saying as long as they were between him and the mysterious Force hunting him. Without warning, the wall imploded, knocking the acolytes closest to it back and showering everyone else with tiny stones and a thin layer of dust. When the dust finally settled, he saw the vision that had been haunting him for so long. A gigantic towering mass of scales and muscles stood in the large hole in the temple's wall, his black scales given a tinge of gray by the dust that had settled on him. He wore nothing but a pair of loose brown pants, his shirtless chest covered in a large, angry scar. He had something Darth Millennial couldn't see strapped to his back and a lightsaber hilt hanging from his belt loop. This was the exact image he had been haunted by for what felt like an entire lifetime. The beast seemed even larger and more imposing because of his awesome and confusing Force signature. It felt like a tornado of the dark side, sucking in the power around it and growing continually larger. Scene change. Naaman could not have been more shocked at the scene that lay before him. His master had told him Darth Millennial had started a cult, so he'd been expecting a large group of people he'd have to deal with, but nothing like this. Before him stood at least 4 dozen human children, looking up at him with terrified faces, some with tears streaming down their fleshy cheeks. The oldest of them couldn't have been more than 13, and the majority of them looked somewhere in the age range of 4 to 6. He stood still for a moment, unsure of what he had to do. He knew he needed to kill the man he saw standing behind the crowd of children, trying to hide while towering above them, but he couldn't kill these kids. Attack him, crush him, kill him, the hooded man in the back shrieked at the children. Naaman still refused to draw his sword. He wasn't sure what he would do if these children attacked him, but it certainly wouldn't be to fight. He supposed he could use the Force to detain or stop this strange army without hurting them, but then, while he was doing that, he would be open to an attack from Darth Millennial. This was the being his master who had chosen to be her first apprentice. What kind of a man hid behind children in a battle? He understood the benefits of finding and recruiting Force sensitives at a younger age so you could train them longer, but expecting them to fight for you seemed despicable. Suddenly, The entire group of children ran outward, parting like a sea and staying on the outer edges of the courtyard, paving a huge, wide path to Darth Millennial. With the children out of the way and out of his thoughts, Naaman could see the man he had been sent to kill for the first time. He was tall for a human and extremely skinny. He was clad in a black robe that clung to his tiny frame. He wore a hood, but Naaman could still see the terrified look on his face as he looked around at his followers who had suddenly disappeared. He was at least 60 years old with long, messy white hair and a large white beard that hung down to his chest. Strangely, unlike most dark-side followers, he had bright blue eyes. Even stranger was his third eye. In the middle of his forehead, a few centimeters above his other eyes, sat a smaller, orange eye. What a weird man, first with the children, and now this. Darth Cognus had told him her last apprentice was a mutant, but he hadn't expected anything this dramatic. Naaman wasn't exactly sure what had just happened. He figured the young children had just become scared and decided not to fight. He drew his sword from his back and slowly walked through the parted sea of children, still fearing some kind of trap. "What are you doing?" the man yelled as Naaman walked forward. "Kill him. I command you to kill him now, you traitors," he cried hysterically. Naaman didn't know the backstory of this situation, and he didn't care. He stood before the small trembling man and marveled again at his master's choice. How could she have ever thought this man, this coward that hid behind his child followers, could ever lead the Sith? Suddenly, the man stopped shaking and the fear in his face melted away. He reached into his robes and pulled out a mask. It was an unmarked white mask that reflected hundreds of small pinpoints of light. Naaman assumed it was some kind of artifact, but he couldn't sense any force radiating from it as he did with most Sith artifacts. The man placed the mask on his face and Naaman nearly laughed aloud when he saw it barely clinging to his face. Clearly, he was not the original owner. Before he dismissed the man completely, he remembered his master's lesson about pride. The moment he thought he was too good to be defeated by someone was the moment before it happened, so, no matter what he thought of this man, he wouldn't let his guard down for a second. The man reached into his robe and grabbed his lightsaber. He ignited it and the shining crimson blade appeared in the dark, starless night. Scene change. Darth Millennial stared at T, he monstrous alien, as he stalked towards him. He would wait for the fool to make the first move. He no longer feared the beast. He understood it all now. The vision had been a warning from the Force, a blessing. Then, when he had gotten his mask and his followers had realized how mighty and dangerous he had become, they had planted the vision of him lying dead in his mind to confuse and frighten him. They had been planning all along to abandon him in his moment of need. Darth Millennial looked into the eyes of his followers and pulled his robe off, letting it flop to the ground. He saw in their faces that they understood the significance behind the move. He was showing that he wasn't afraid. How could the vision of him lying on the ground, buried in his burned robes, come true if he wasn't even wearing the robes at all? He was showing them that he knew how deep their deception went. Despite all this, he would prevail. They had made the mistake of underestimating him, of underestimating his link to the darkness. With the mask, there was no chance he would be defeated by this barbarian, and then he would bring the fires of vengeance down on them. He would burn them all from existence, each and every one of them. He used the anger over their betrayal and the sweet anticipation of their demise to open up his channel to the mistress, letting her gifts and strength fill him as he waited for the reptilian monster. It suddenly bounded forward, closing the distance between them rapidly. Why? Without letting him get close, Darth Millennial released his force in a torrent of force lightning, hoping to end this fight quickly so he could get to punishing his followers. Scene change. Naaman was surprised at the strained, ropey muscles on the man's arms. Clearly, he still followed some training regimen. The man now stood with his lightsaber drawn in nothing but loose black pants. Even though he had more muscles than Naaman had expected, seeing him like this made him seem even more vulnerable. His chest was shrunken in and his ribs were protruding so far it seemed like they were about to burst from his paper-thin skin. The skin of his abdomen was even lighter than his face. He seemed to be nothing but a ghost. Now that his robes were off, he saw the dozens of trinkets adorning the ghastly man. He had golden necklaces dangling from his neck and his claw-like fingers were covered with ridiculous-looking rings. He looked stupid with the abundance of jewelry, an ill-fitting mask, and no shirt. He saw the lightning streaming towards him. Instead of altering his course or buffing up his force shield, he simply held Kaiasek Darafan out in front of him and kept running. The white-blue lightning arced towards the sword, filtering into the tip. The blade changed from its usual dark gray to a shining white, small flecks of electricity shooting off the blade. He felt a surge of energy and strength shooting from the blade into him. It felt good to see the pitiful man's shocked face as he came bearing down on him. He was seconds away from Darth Millennial with his glowing sword raised above his head, somewhat disappointed at how quickly this would end. Rogan! A scream broke through the night, freezing Naman mid-attack. It felt strange to hear his old name. It felt as if that was a completely different person. He was about to turn around when he was blasted from the front by the Force. He sailed away from Darth Millennial and landed on his back, skidding across the stone floor. His sword flew from his hands as he slammed to the ground. It clattered to the ground, discharging its PNT-up electricity harmlessly. Naman quickly stood up and looked to the wall he had come through. He cursed under his breath. It was his previous Jedi captor and soldier of his army, Kinza. She was wearing plain pants and shirt instead of robes, and her skin was a pale yellow again. He had planned to eventually track her down to see how her descent into the dark side was going, but now was not the time he wanted to meet her. He looked over his shoulder at Darth Millennial to see how he was reacting to all of this. Star Wars: The Grey War, Chapter 22. Kinza immediately regretted yelling and drawing attention to herself. She didn't understand the situation and she should have watched and waited for longer until she knew what was going on. Now she may have to fight Rogan and the masked, shirtless man at the same time. She stepped through the large, inexplicable hole in the wall and immediately became exponentially more confused. Standing against the walls of the compound on either side was about 40 or 50 children. She had no idea what was going on, whether this was a real fight or a training exercise. Why were there only 2 adults in this supposed cult, and who had made this fresh-looking hole? No matter the situation, she knew she definitely should have let it play out before getting involved, but it was too late now. She ignited her lightsaber and continued moving towards the 2 men, no matter the strange circumstances. She had finally found Rogan, and this would be the end. Scene change. Darth Millennial watched as this Rogan reached out and called his strange sword back into his hand. The scaled man was staring at the yellow Twi'lek Jedi as she slowly stalked towards him. Seeing Rajan's distraction, Darth Millennial threw his lightsaber towards the man's broad, scaly back. Rogan ducked as the blade neared him, apparently sensing the attack without looking. Darth Millennial let his lightsaber continue until it reached the unknown Jedi woman. She crouched down and jumped up, launching over the lightsaber and coming down on Rogan. He held his sword up to block her while downstroking. Amazingly, it stopped her lightsaber. This man's sword was continuing to surprise Darth Millennial. Rogan moved his sword to the left, forcing the woman to lean over to her right. Rogan brought his knee up, slamming it into the Jedi's ribs. Millennial dashed towards them. The Force had granted him the gift of this Jedi to help him defeat the monster, so he needed to keep her alive as long as possible. Scene change. Kinza gasped, trying to regain her breath. She sensed something behind her and dashed to the left just as the human's lightsaber flew past her on its return trip to its owner. Rogan swung his sword, batting the lightsaber away rather than trying to avoid it. She looked beyond Rogan for a moment and saw a masked human running towards them, grabbing his lightsaber out of the air. It seemed as though the man shouldn't even be alive anymore. He looked like a tall skeleton with the thinnest layer of skin draped over his bones. He had strangely large, muscular arms that looked like they belonged on a different body. As he ran, dozens of gold chains sloshed around, banging into his face and chest and making them look even more ridiculous. He was running fast, but with a slight hunch. It would have given him away as an older man, even if Kinza couldn't see his sunken body. He was clearly using the Force to keep up his speed and strength. Kinza didn't know this man, and he was clearly a follower of the dark side, but nonetheless she could use him as an ally. Rogan brought a hard cut down on her and she brought her lightsaber up to block it. The strength behind the sword rocked her, almost pushing her onto her back. "Upgraded your equipment since the last time we fought?" She grunted, struggling to keep his sword away from her. He hissed back at her, showing his sharp teeth. "That's not the only thing that's changed," he responded, pressing down onto her even harder. Kinza managed to push the sword up and she saw the masked man rushing towards Rajan's back. His lightsaber extended. Kinza slashed at his stomach, hoping he couldn't block both attacks at the same time. Rogan brought his sword up behind him, blocking the human's overhanded chop. At the same time, he swung his free arm to meet Kinza's lightsaber. She expected to slice right through his arm, but instead, her weapon was forced back as if it had been batted away by another lightsaber. Before she could recover from her shock, Rogan lifted his leg and kicked her square in the chest. Scene change. Naman pushed his sword and Darth Millennial's lightsaber back. He spun around quickly and brought his empty hand around and smashed his fist into the side of Millennial's face. The ill-fitting mask flew off the man and Nemo and felt his jaw crunch beneath his fist. Teeth and blood quickly followed after the mask. Darth Millennial was spun around from the force of the punch and fell to the ground. Naman turned around again to finish off Kinza, but found himself suddenly unable to move. Kinza walked around to face him. Naman strained with all his might, trying in vain to break out of this mysterious binding. Kinza lifted her saber, preparing to strike him down. He remembered Kinza had once told him that Jedi didn't strike down bound, helpless men. Clearly, she had changed. Kinza's lightsaber paused for a moment. She held it in both hands poised over her head, no doubt savoring the moment before she killed him. Naman was prepared for this end. He had lived all he could. Darth Cognus would find another apprentice and the Sith line would survive, even if it was without him. Her saber began its descent. Time seemingly slowed. Suddenly, without warning, she was out of his view, replaced by a field of electricity. Scene change. Kinza felt the burning pain and shielded herself quickly from the lightning, managing to take minimal damage. She was still pushed back by the force of the lightning, but she managed to land on her feet unharmed, with only superficial burns. She settled herself and glared at the man who had taken her moment of victory. She was taken back once again by his deathly appearance. She had known he was old and unhealthy, but it showed so much worse in his face. His skin was so tight, white stretched over the dry skull he called a face that it looked like it was going to snap. He had scraggly wild hair that was falling out in some places and a beard that fell from his dry, drawn-in mouth to his caved-in chest. His thin, pale skin showed veins beneath. The blue veins were so prominent that from where she was standing, it looked as if his entire face had a blue hue. Besides the scary blue, the only color on his face was the bright red blood leaking from his mouth where Rogan had hit him. He looked so unnatural it was a second before she even noticed his third eye. It was orange and small and it seemed to bore into her as she stared at it. She shivered as she saw it blink. This was an extremely unsettling man. He looked so strange and unnatural she would have guessed he was some strange near-human species if not for her past experience with the effects of the dark side on people. The man turned from her and quickly ran to retrieve his mask that had fallen on the floor. If he looked that bad, wearing the mask would probably be that important to her too. She started to step forward, hoping to finally finish off Rogan while he was still trapped in her force stun and the mutant human was distracted. As she stepped towards him, she was blown back again. Scene change. Naman roared and his energy was released in a concussive force repulse, shattering the invisible bonds containing him and pushing Kinza further away from him. The wave expanded outward from Naman and met into Darth Millennial just as he wrapped his fingers around his mask, sending him flying away. Naman chastised himself for his moment of failure. He needed to keep his senses open for any threats all around him in this battle. He wasn't used to fighting more than one person at once. He'd fought Darth Cognus and her illusions at the same time before, but it was different with real people, less predictable. He backed up so he could see both Kinza and Darth Millennial at the same time. His two opponents stood up and glared at him, Kinza brushing the dust off her clothes while Darth Millennial hurriedly put his mask back on. Scene change. This was all a test, just a test from the Force. Darth Millennial knew he couldn't defeat the monster alone, nor could he defeat the Jedi alone. He had never seen someone as imposing as Rogan be held in a Force stun, and the reptilian beast had been trapped for quite some time. Knowing this, the Force had brought them both, so they could defeat each other. The Force was testing him. He had to use his mind to win this battle, not his muscles like some simpleton brute. He would play them against each other, wisely staying on the outskirts of the conflict while they tired themselves out. Then he could extinguish whichever one of them survived. It was all just a test. Scene change. Kinza jumped to Rogan immediately and hit the ground running. She switched her lightsaber to her left hand and stabbed low at his legs, forcing the gigantic man to bend low to block it. She shot up quickly with her fist extended, aiming for his head. She cocooned her fist with the force to protect herself from his thick, sharp scales. As they connected, Rogan was rocked backwards, but not nearly as much as she had expected. Before she could press into offense, she had to twist to avoid a stab aimed at her chest. She was forced 00D to quickly duck at a follow-up slash aimed at her head, amazed at the speed of his attacks. He followed up that attack with a TWO-handed swipe from the other side aimed at her stomach. Tired of dodging, she brought her saber to bear, using an inverted grip and holding it in a downward guard. The intensity of his cleaving swipe overwhelmed her and it almost forced the saber from her grasp. His sword continued on, unimpeded by her block, cutting through her shirt and slicing a shallow line across her abdomen. She immediately put the pain in a box and forced it away, concentrating on the task at hand. She ducked under his next attack and immediately jumped up and flipped forward over him before he could attack again. As she soared over him, her head pointed to the ground, she rained blows down on him. Scene change. Naman held his sword up, easily blocking Kinsey's rapid but predictable strikes. If she hoped to surprise or overwhelm him with the flips and dashes, she would be disappointed. He had trained with Darth Cognus, who primarily utilized a varied form of Form 4, Adaru, on offense which focused on frag, U-end jumps, quick spins and other acts of agility. He spun around, Kaisik Darafran outstretched to turn him faster. Just as she landed, the sword moved towards her. She bent backwards, almost folding in half to avoid his screaming blade. He swung his sword up and was about to redirect it to a downward chop when he felt something brewing on the fringes of his perception, coming from behind him. Scene change. After watching the fast-paced fight for only a few seconds, he could tell the Jedi had a slight disadvantage, one that would quickly lead to her defeat. He was convinced the slight edge came from the mysterious sword the monster held, tainting it with his filthy claws. The Jedi didn't understand what the weapon could do, and so she would fall to it. Darth Millennial couldn't have that happen. Not yet. He shot a quick stream of lightning at the brute's back, hoping to distract him for a moment, allowing the Jedi to gain the advantage and prolong the fight a little more. Scene Chang-E. Before he could even respond to the tingle at the edge of his perception, Kaisik Darafran swung backwards, seemingly moving on its own without him doing anything. He felt the surge of energy pass through the sword and into him, and he knew without looking that his weapon had absorbed the lightning. He didn't have time not to contemplate what it meant that his sword seemed to have defended him by itself. He swung the sword back around and into an overhanded chop. Scene change. Kinza had time to recover her balance, so she was able to simply sidestep as the blade descended down on her. As it flew past her, she noticed its strange coloring. Usually Namon's sword was a dark, smoky gray, but at the moment, it was a brilliantly gleaming white. She remembered that had been its color when she had first announced herself and entered the fray. She knew that was important, but in the short time before the sword hit the floor, she couldn't remember what it meant. Scene change. Rather upon stopping the sword or changing its direction, Naman simply let it smash into the floor. He steeled himself for the explosion of electrical energy. His sword clanged against the stone floor and released its lightning. The ball of bright white electricity immediately expanded outward like a bomb. Naman felt the sharp burning pain as the field passed over him, but he had been prepared. The brunt of the lightning had been absorbed by his force shield. Kinza, however, had not been so lucky. Scene change. Kinza had been taken completely off guard by the sudden discharge of deadly energy. She lay in a crumpled heap at Namon's feet, still alive but badly wounded. She drew a few haggard breaths and tried to push herself to her feet. Her burned skin and twitching nerves protested the action and her arms gave out. She fell back to the floor, her chin slamming painfully into the stone. She thought it was strange that Rogan hadn't finished her off yet. Scene change. Lightning had expanded a giant balloon being pumped with air. By the time it had reached Darth Millennial, it had expanded and dissipated enough for him to just let it pass harmlessly over him. He saw the Jedi was in trouble, so he ran at Naman to protect her. Darth Millennial flew about wildly with amazing speed and precision, pressing his attack as best as he could, changing the direction of his saber mid-attack, and using force attacks to trip up and confuse the dim-witted, hulking mass of flesh. Clearly he was wrong. This wasn't a test. Well, it was, but not in the way he thought. He was clearly holding his own here. He didn't need the Jedi to defeat the monster, or the monster to defeat the Jedi. The Force was just testing his self-control. He could easily defeat both of them alone, but he was supposed to watch as the aliens fought it out without joining in himself. His mission now was to see how long he could keep the two of them fighting. So, now he was toying with the slow beast while he waited for the weak Jedi to get up and rejoin the fight. He used the Force to grab a large chunk of stone from the broken wall and launched it at Rajan's side. He then sped his attack up to unthinkable speeds, trying to keep the silly beast from detecting the chunk of stone bearing down on him. Scene change. Naaman felt something coming from Kayasik Darafun. It wasn't the continual transference of the force, it felt like some kind of warning. He focused less on the confusing flailing of the old man he had come to kill and widened his perception. He saw the stone flying towards him and he ducked as a huge block of stone whizzed over his head. It continued onto the line of children up against the walls beside them. One of the older, female children grabbed a young boy in the stone's path and yanked him out of harm's way. There was a millisecond pause in the fighting. Both he and Darth Millennial were shocked he had avoided the rubble. Before the battle joined again, Naaman thrust his hand out, pushing lightly with the force. He easily broke through Darth Millennial's force shield and knocked him off balance, forcing him to take a couple steps back to stabilize himself. Naaman took a quick lunging step forward and punched out with his left hand. It collected solidly with the metal mask, bending it inward. He had Darth Millennial scream in pain as the bent metal pierced his skin, further damaging his already disfigured face. Darth Millennial backed up quickly, waving his saber frantically to cover his retreat. Scene change. Pain radiated from his face as Darth Millennial practically ran from the hulking, scaly monstrosity. What an idiot. The Force had told him not to get involved. He had stayed in the fight for too long and this was his punishment. If he had just gotten out when he was supposed to, when the Force had told him to, he would have been fine, and his mask wouldn't be bent. He didn't want to take it off because he needed the connection it gave him, but it dug into his skin whenever he moved. It had missed his third eye by a few centimeters. At least the Force had given him that. It was a good punishment, making the thing he needed hurt him. It was poetic. He couldn't see out of the mask anymore, so he needed to either remove or fix it. He put his hand on the metal mask and tried to force the kink out slightly, but, of course, he couldn't bend the solid metal. The Force was too smart for that. He ripped it off his face, grunting in pain as the jagged metal slid out of the messy laceration it had created in his nose. He used the pain in his face and the anger at his failure to tap into the Force within him. He shot a broad force wave at Rogan, opting for a purely physical attack rather than force lightning, which seemed to have no effect on him. The oncoming wave caught up to him just as he was turning to the struggling Jedi, overwhelming his defenses and knocking him forward onto his face. Darth Millennial paused for a few seconds to catch his breath and push away the pain of his face. He looked past Rogan and saw the Twi'lek slowly rising to her knees. It was about time. Scene change. Kinza stood for a moment, her muscles still twitching from the overload of electricity. She had managed to bury the pain of her burnt, bubbling flesh, but she couldn't control her muscle spasms. She resigned herself to ignore the random spasms and ran at Rogan, who was just standing to face her. She didn't know what had happened between Rogan and the Mutt, and while she was down, but clearly, the older man was the reason she wasn't dead. She gathered and internalized the Force as she ran, using it to augment her speed and strength and heal the smallest of her wounds. She dove forward, planting her hands on the ground for a moment, letting her momentum carry her legs over her arms before pushing off her hands. She launched herself horizontally, feet first towards Rogan. Her heels smashed into his chin, launching him onto his back. Her momentum carried her past Rogan and she landed roughly behind him, but still on her feet. Scene change. Naaman grunted as he slammed once again onto the stone floor, this time landing on his back. His head hit the hard stone and his jaws compressed together, chipping the tips of a couple teeth. He swung his sword up, barely blocking Kinza's downward chop. He frantically blocked as Kinza hammered her lightsaber down on him. Suddenly, a bright red, flipping lightsaber flew into his view. It bounced off Kinza's lightsaber, stopping her next hacking slash and returning to Darth Millennial. Naaman took advantage of the opportunity and kicked up at her. His foot slammed into the inside of her thigh, forcing her leg out and making her collapse to one knee. Naaman jumped up before she could rise to her feet. He stabbed down at her just as she was getting up. She hit his sword to the side, parrying the blow rather than trying to take the brunt of it. She slashed up with her saber as she pushed herself up. Rather than blocking, Naaman simply let the saber hit, using the Force to deflect the burning saber. He felt the sting on his chest but kept it from piercing his scales. Scene change. Her legs ached as she got her feet underneath her. Rajan's kick had stretched the muscles of her inner thigh. There was no understanding Rogan's defenses. It seemed like he could block any lightsaber attack he wanted and turn any amount of lightning into a weapon for himself. Yet, the kick had knocked him too high back, and she had seen him be affected by other force-based attacks. She ducked under Rajan's slash, then took 2 quick steps back to avoid being cleaved into, her overextended muscles quickly recovering. Kinza took a quick step forward and kicked at his abdomen, but almost bounced off his scaly stomach. She swore she saw him laugh at her pathetic attack as he lifted his sword and stabbed at her. Kinza spun around his sword and lashed out with her lightsaber, aiming for his hip. At the last second before she hit him, she shifted the angle of her blow and hit his leg. A sick smile crept onto her face as she felt her lightsaber bite into his flesh. Her smile dropped as she felt something coming behind her. She spun quickly, abandoning Rogan, to see the older man, his mask abandoned and his face wild and bloody, descending upon her. As she stepped back from Rogan, she shot a thin tendril of her dark lightning at the masked mutant. He easily batted her pathetic attack away and continued on. She could have conjured more lightning, but she was still hesitant. She still got lightheaded whenever she used too much. He came in high, cutting diagonally at her neck. She met his saber in a reverse grip above her head. It felt nice to be able to block an attack again. Rajan's sword was so heavy it often felt unstoppable. He bounced off her saber and came back with the same attack on the other side. She simply turned her wrist and blocked again. He continued pounding down on her from above. A curdling scream came from his disfigured face and his attacks became more and more ferocious. As she walked back, she saw Rogan nursing his leg from the corner of her eye. She wanted to go after him, but the mutant's quick, brutal attacks forced her to concentrate on defense. Scene change. With shaking legs and gritted teeth, Naman got to his legs under him, putting up thick barriers in an attempt to block out the pain. He saw Darth Millennial pressing into Kinza, forcing her to retreat, but he knew the Sith wouldn't be able to hold the advantage for long. He gripped Kyasek Darthon tightly, feeding at his pain, frustration and rage. He used the force the sword returned to him to stoke the fires within him until they burned white hot. The burning heat in his core spread out, taking over his entire body. He force leaped over his 2 enemies locked in combat, ignoring the flash of pain from his gashed leg. As he reached the apex of his jump, he couldn't contain the roar of rage that tore through him. The fighting paused and they looked up at him as he descended down. The fighting broke as they moved to get away from him and prepared their defenses before he slammed to the ground. When he landed, his force created tremors in the ground that spread out from him. Both his opponents managed to stay standing, but they took small steps backwards, trying to find footing on a floor that had just become a mess of rubble. Before the earth calmed, he struck out at Darth Millennial, who was barely able to get his lightsaber up in time to meet his brutal 2-handed slash. His sword blew past the older man's weak defenses and forced his lightsaber from his grasp. Naman grunted with strained effort as he reversed the powerful attack with only one hand, using his left hand to shoot a torrent of lightning at Kinza, who had just recovered enough to join the fight. His reversal had been too slow and Millennial was able to retreat, recalling his lightsaber back to his stretched hand as he stepped away. Kinza reached out with her hands, taking the lightning and shooting it back at Naman. Instead of using his blade to absorb it, Naman simply ducked under the stream, letting it continue on to Darth Millennial, who used his reacquired lightsaber to deflect the thin bolt of lightning. It flew over to the line of children followers and, once again, the same female jumped in the way of the lightning and absorbed it, protecting younger cultists around her from the deeply bolt. At the same time, the 2 smaller opponents jumped at him, Kinza coming in high and Darth Millennial striking low as if they had coordinated their attack. Naman turned and blocked Darth Millennial's attack with one hand and used the other to force push Kinza. It wasn't strong enough to push Kinza back, but it managed to interrupt her attack and take her out of the fight for just a moment. He pressed in on Darth Millennial, swinging at his chest. While he was attacking the older Sith, he used the force to locate Kinza behind him. He felt Kinza swing at his back and he responded with his tail. He swooshed it at her legs as Kinza extended forward to hit his back. His tail connected with her legs and swiped them out from under her. He felt her fall to her back. Still facing Darth Millennial, he reached out with his free hand at his master's old apprentice. He grabbed onto the man and flung the skinny wretch backwards, easily tossing him over Kinza, who was just starting to stand. Before Darth Millennial landed, he righted himself and used the force to lower himself slowly and softly to the ground. He launched himself high, up and over both Kinza and Naman, back to the position he was in before. Naman took a few steps back, repositioning so the 3 combatants were in a triangle rather than a line with him in the middle. Star Wars: The Grey War, Chapter 23. Kinza studied her opponents in the calm moments before battle. Rogan had blood dripping from his face, some of his teeth were clearly broken in half, he had lots of scales missing or dented, and he had a huge blackened gash on the outside of his right thigh. The mutant's mask was broken and discarded. His jaw was broken and puffy, and his nose had a huge painful red cut across it which appeared pressed into his face. His right eye was almost swollen shut. Now she took stock of herself. She had 1 or 2 cracked ribs, probably from when Naman had kneed her earlier in the fight or when he had kicked her in the chest later on. It felt like someone was lightly stabbing her every time she took a breath. She had a thin superficial cut running across her abdomen just under her chest. Her skin was pretty severely burned. In some places the top layers had cracked and split, the underlayers bubbling up. Besides her skin, the clothes she wore were littered with blackened holes and her entire body was sore from the explosion. The stillness was broken by the mutant, who lunged at her with a deranged growl. She moved her saber up, deflecting his stab. She knew Naman would attack her next, so she spun to face him but left her sword arm behind. She twirled her saber into a reverse grip and blocked the follow-up slash by the mutant without looking at it. Staying in reverse grip, she swung her arm around and connected with Rajan's sword before he could gain any momentum on his attack. She brought her arm up and switched her grip, bringing her saber down in a two-handed chop. Rogan brought his guard up and Kinza pressed down with all her strength, trying unsuccessfully to overpower him. She gave up and let her lightsaber slide down his sword, sending up a strange spray of electrical sparks. She whirled quickly, batting away yet another stab from the bearded man that had been announced to her by a desperate yell. She completed her spin and, once again, was facing Rogan. She came down on his right shoulder, forcing him into an awkward block. She quickly slid her saber up his sword, this time aiming to gouge into his head. He simply twisted his wrist so the guard of his sword handle was facing up. Clearly, it was made of whatever strange material his blade was, because it stopped her lightsaber as well. She was only centimeters from his face and she tried in vain to push her lightsaber past his defenses. She realized suddenly that it was playing completely to his strength, instead of hers, speed. She came at him from the other side, forcing him to move his guard. Before she hit his sword, she moved lower, aiming for his ribs, forcing him to quickly bring his sword to block. Before she could continue her plan to overwhelm him with speed, she heard a grunt from behind her. She pivoted sideways and a red lightsaber stabbed in front of her. She chopped down, trying to hit the man's arm, but had to abandon the strike in order to dip under a backhanded swipe from Rajan's clawed left hand. As she came up she brought her lightsaber up, aiming for under Naman's arm that had just swung out wide. Rogan managed to bring his sword down on Kinza's lightsaber and push it down, but not before Kinza clipped his underarm. Though there was no noise, she could feel the mutant coming at her with a crossing slash. She held her hilt low, her blade pointed up, and blocked it. She swung her saber to the left, forcing his to come along with it. She then retraced her weapon's path, aiming to cut him about the chest. He stepped back, Kate quickly, and Kinza pushed forward with a force, using his backward momentum to force him onto his back, giving her some time alone with Rogan. She turned to him, planning to start an attack sequence, but Rogan had already recovered from the tiny wound she had inflicted and he was on the offense. Scene change. Naman was swinging wildly, just trying to land a blow on this Jedi. She was almost as good as Darth Cognews at frustrating him with her elusiveness. She was dipping, jumping and dodging, but Naman knew eventually he would be moving too fast for her to keep up. And, at this point, he had so much power behind each swing there would be no way she could stop it. He swiped low, aiming for her legs. She jumped high over his blade and he brought his sword up, planning to slice down through her before she could dodge or jump back out of the way. As she was falling back down, she surprised him by releasing a wave of force down at the ground. As she pushed down, she was pushed back up as if she had jumped and she started flipping backwards. Scene change. Patience. It was all about patience. Before, he had been randomly trying to stab the Jedi in the back, but she somehow always knew he was there. So, now he had been lying in waiting, with patience, for her to be distracted. He'd seen the beast slash at her legs and, as she jumped, he decided this was his time to strike. This was his chance. He lunged forward just as she started falling back to the ground. Then, she suddenly shocked him by jumping suddenly on thin air like it was solid ground. She flipped over him and he suddenly felt her feet on his back. Scene change. Kinza had felt the stab from behind, coming from the increasingly predictable mutant, without seeing it. As she was about to land from jumping over Rajan's attack at her legs, she pushed off with a force, aiming it at the ground. It sent small pieces of the broken ground into the air, and she used the force bouncing off the floor back at her to rise up and flip over the orange-eyed mutant and his attack. Instead of landing on her back, she kept spinning, and then planted both her feet on the man's back and kicked him forward. She landed on her back, but used the force to cushion the fall. She looked up and saw the strange old man was facing much worse. Scene change. Darth Millennial was forced forward, unable to stop himself in time. He was launched forward by a mix of his own momentum and the alien woman's kick. He flew straight into the scaly man's terrible chop aimed that had been for the Jedi. Scene change. His sword came down quickly, slicing into the man's ear and lopping off part of his head. It continued down and cleaved into his neck, smashing through his collarbone. It kept falling, carving through flesh and bone all the way down, almost reaching his waist. Scene change. It was finally happening. He was leaving, ascending, rising above this terrible mortal world filled with backstabbers and unworthy beings. He was being accepted by the Force. This is what he was meant for. This is why he had been born. He had been chosen before he was even born to become the one who stood by her side. This had been the plan. There had never been any test, only this, only the plan. He wasn't supposed to defeat these two beings. This was all just a threshold he had to cross over to move into the next stage, to move into godhood. He felt no pain as he floated through the open gate, into his new life. The Force protected him from the pain of death. The darkness rapidly closed in around him. He couldn't believe it was finally happening. The next time he awoke, he would be with the Force, watching over the galaxy with her. This had always been the plan. Scene change. With a grunt, Darth Naaman yanked his sword from the belly of Millennial. He watched with satisfaction as the body fell to the ground with an empty thud. And so passed the fool, the man who had rejected the legacy of the Sith. Darth Naaman watched as Kinsa slowly got to her feet, staring at the mangled body she was partially responsible for. He saw the gears turning in her mind, and he wondered what she was thinking about. Whatever it was, Naaman didn't give her much time to contemplate it. He reached out with his free hand and called on Pyasik Darifun. The blade poured the force into him, and he conjured a river of lightning, shooting it at the meddling Jedi. If it wasn't for her, he could be halfway back to Argonar by now. He fed his excitement at becoming Darth and his growing frustration into his weapon, and, in response, he drank in the force it supplied to him, continuing his torrent of electricity. He couldn't even see her. She was surrounded on all sides by a wall of electricity. No matter how strong she was, eventually he would overwhelm her force defenses. Scene change. Kinsa felt the burning heat coursing around her, only a thin shield of light side force protecting her from the burning lightning. She knew eventually it wouldn't be enough to keep it at bay. She needed a plan. As the heat burned around her, she felt a similar heat rising up inside her, starting to simmer. She recognized the heat in the darkness, and she encouraged it. She welcomed it. Suddenly, without her releasing it, her force shield evaporated and the lightning all rushed in. While it scorched and burned her, the lightning also fed her. She screamed with pain as the lightning poured into her. It went into her and met with a burning instinct to her. The lightning coursed through her and around her. The static heat became a welcome feeling, and her shrieks of pain stopped. After she had absorbed enough of his lightning and she felt like exploding with energy, she fired her own back. Scene change. Just as Naaman was about to stop with his assault, he had heard her screams, and he knew that no one could survive such an attack. His river of dark blue lightning was suddenly taken over by a flood of black-purple electricity. It streamed that far, on Kinsa in an amazing display of relentless power. It overwhelmed his own barrage and pushed his own assault back until the blue lightning sparked in front of his face, hurting his eyes. He stopped his deluge of lightning and held his sword out in front of him. At first, it was all funneled into Pyasik Darifun, and Naaman thought he had nothing to worry about. Then the blade started glowing so bright it hurt his eyes, and the pulses of energy it shot through him began to be too much. The hilt slowly started to glow as well, and it burned hot. Acting on instinct, without thinking, Darth Naaman dropped the blade. Filling with dread with every passing millisecond, he watched it drop slowly to the floor, seeming to move in slow motion. What followed was an explosion like he had never seen or felt. The lightning grabbed him and shot him backwards. He landed with a thump he didn't even feel onto the stone courtyard. The lightning had destroyed him completely. He lay on his stomach, complet, unable to move or do anything. He realized he couldn't feel a thing. He thought the lightning had somehow zapped his nerve endings. As the thought crossed through his mind, his feelings came back, and it was all pain. He felt as if he had electricity running through his veins, as if his blood had been replaced by liquid lightning. He couldn't form even the simplest thought. His brain was overloaded with pain. His heart was jumping between beating 1,000 times a minute and seizing up and seemingly stopping. His aching muscles were twitching uncontrollably. He lay there on the floor, unable to control himself, twitching and seizing for what felt like half an hour, every single nerve aflame. Eventually the twitching subsided and all he got was the occasional muscle spasm. He slowly and painfully lifted his head to see what Kinsel was doing. Luckily for him, she was still lying down as well. He was nowhere near ready to move. Star Wars: The Grey War. Chapter 24. Was that you? How did you do that? What's wrong with you? She was lying on soft, comfortable grass in the middle of a bright forest. The warm yellow sun shone its rays down on her, making her skin tingle with its warmth. Trees and bushes surrounded her. It felt like spring. The flowers were just starting to bloom. She could hear strange birds chirping in the distance and she imagined this forest was full of small creatures. ULDNTC. This beautiful scene was broken only by a human Padawan she recognized from somewhere standing over her. She slowly sat up, her head dizzy from lying down for too long. The young Padawan still towered above her, his face bright red with emotion and covered with fear and anger. She knew he had said something, but she had been in such a lovely daze she'd missed it. Was that you? How did you do that? What's wrong with you? He repeated with his voice raised, demanding answers from her. The comforting, fuzzy feeling she'd had since waking up in this beautiful place fell away immediately, replaced by a cold feeling of dread not even the sun hanging in the sky could fix. She immediately felt defensive. She had done something wrong. What kind of person are you? No, she pleaded with the young boy. She wasn't sure what she had done to deserve this treatment, but she knew if she could just explain herself, it would be okay. She started to stand up. She no longer felt comfortable lying on the grass. You don't understand. You couldn't understand. Slowly the soft face of the young boy transformed into the hard, noble features of Master Rilf. His face was lacked in his customary charming smile, replaced by a grim look of disappointment. As the face transformed, the body grew, filling into the large, broad-shouldered frame of her old master. The scene round her transformed as well. She was still in the forest, but the seasons changed quickly, turning from spring to fall. The flowers and leaves died and fell off, leaving behind barren, scraggly trees. The grass that had been so soft turned coarse and sharp. The sun went down, replaced by a pale moon, leaving her skin cold. A cool, wet mist filtered into the forest, sticking to her skin and obscuring her vision. She stopped standing and sat back down, intimidated by the sudden sight of her old master. As she looked up at him with fear, she felt like a weak, 14-year-old child again. I am not you, our master, Master Rilf told her, his voice hard and cutting. No Padawan of mine would fall so far away. You are a disgrace, to me, to yourself, and to the Order. There was a stab of pain in her heart at hearing the man she had respected above all else condemn her and cast her away. She still didn't know what had caused this. She knew she had fallen away from the Jedi because they weren't doing as much as she thought they should, but she couldn't remember what had happened in the past day to make everyone so furious with her. Kinsey knew it wasn't the correct response, but she still couldn't help but getting angry. The Order is a disgrace to itself. I'm working while they do nothing. The Order is a disgrace to me. She called back, raising her voice slightly. How dare you? He yelled at her in a tone of voice she had heard him use only few times before. Before he could continue, a bolt of lightning cracked from the clear sky and hit her master. The blinding light faded and Kinsey saw that Master Rilf caught a flame. As the fire spread along his body, he made no sound and his face showed no pain. The flame consumed him and his body burned into a large pile of gray ash. A gust of cold wind came from her left, howling through the trees and making them rattle together. As it passed by her, it chilled her to the bone and swept up the pile of fine ashes. It carried them as the wind traveled on, taking them out of view and leaving her alone in the strange forest. Kinsey was ashamed to find she was relieved as her master disappeared. She knew that the path she had taken was right. Maybe what she was doing wasn't perfect, but at least it was something. She remembered the Grey Jedi. She had stopped looking for them when she had felt herself growing darker, but now she wished she hadn't. They would have been able to teach her how to use her emotions without changing herself. Doing it all alone like she wasn't working out as well as she'd hoped. No matter the mistake she made though, she knew it was worth it. The Jedi, the accusing Padawan, and even Master Rilf were the ones who were wrong. She had no questions in her mind, and the last thing she needed was someone looking over her shoulder and judging her for things they didn't have the strength to do. She was feeling proud of herself and her independence. She started to stand up. She needed to find a way out of this forest when, without warning, her world started falling apart. The dark trees and starry night were replaced by growing dots of an overcast night, lightning bouncing around in the clouds. There was a stone floor, and a line of children watching her. In a flash she snapped back to reality. She was lying on her side in the gray courtyard of the compound of this strange cult. She had come here to find and kill Rogan, the scourge of the galaxy and the bane of her existence. The last thing she remembered was she was channeling Sith lightning at Naman, streams and streams of it. Definitely more than she had ever created before. Then there had been an explosion of electricity, if she remembered. She assumed it was from Rajan's strange sword. Instead of the lightning burning her, however, it had fed her, pouring wild strength into her, so much that she felt like she could burst. And then it wouldn't stop, and she had so much energy bouncing around inside her started trying to get out. She felt her muscles pull and stretch, her physical body trying desperately to hold together. For a moment she honestly thought she was going to unravel into nothingness. Before anything could happen, her body, like it had done in the past around Sith lightning, had just shut down. She thought back to that weird dream she'd had. She remembered the face of the Padawan from when she had woken up after using lightning on Quill. It must just be a sort of sense memory. Her body remembered what happened last time after she had used too much lightning. She wasn't exactly sure why Master Rilf was there. Though she had thought about him a lot since he had died, he hadn't come into her mind in a long time. Her musings were interrupted by a loud scraping coming from behind her. She turned to see Rajan's sword slowly sliding across the stone floor. She followed the trajectory of the sword to see Rogan himself, hunched over, standing on shaky, twitching legs with his hand stretched towards the sword. The sword slowly sped up and lifted off the ground, flying into his hand. Immediately, Rajin stood up straighter and his legs seemed more solid beneath him. She could sense his strength returning and his legs stopped wobbling. He started to slow walk towards her, holding his sword low at his side, the tip scraping ominously across the stone floor. He seemed to grow stronger and more solid with every step he took. Kinza refused to wait for Rogan to get to her and start the dance where she would always end up losing. She pushed her strange dream from her mind and got to her feet. Her ribs ached slightly, but it felt like most of her wounds had been partially healed. She dashed to him before he could move his sword. She swung her saber all around, whirling it wildly in confusing patterns, trying to score a hit on her nemesis before he turned the tables on her, but she couldn't. She figured he would be slower with a heavy sword and he had seemed hurt before, but he seemed impossibly fast. Every time she tried some strange combination, hoping to slip through, all she met was his rock-solid defenses. Just as she had feared, the tide of the duel slowly but surely began to change. His defenses became broad sweeping moves that slapped her weightless saber away while forcing her to get out of the way of the sword. Then, without a single moment that she could call the turning point, she was on defense, and the deadly dance had begun. Still, she was determined not to fall fully into this rut she couldn't escape from. She saw him twist his body and she knew he was getting ready to unleash a powerful slash from the side. She moved in to cut him off. Before he could build up speed or strength, she brought her lightsaber up to block the slash aimed at her chest. She stepped back, giving herself a wider stance, and set herself for the blow. His sword was out to the side, almost behind him, as he started his swing towards her. She was convinced that, since she was only leaving about a meter for him to gather speed, she could hold up to his sword. The attack connected, and she felt a painful sting in her hand and her lightsaber flew from her hands. Without even thinking about it, she jumped backwards, knowing she had to get out of Namon's range. As she moved back, trying to give herself a bit of space, she looked around for her lightsaber but couldn't see it. Without vision on it, she couldn't call it back to her. She looked around the mangled body of the dead mutant, but couldn't see his lightsaber either. She assumed he was lying on it, but she didn't have time to lift the body and find out with Rogan chasing after her. She looked around desperately for any kind of weapon she could use and her eyes fell on the lightsaber hilt hanging from Rajan's belt. It looked like the basic lightsabers Padawans constructed. She assumed he had used it before he'd found or made his current weapon. Still backpedaling away from him, she reached out with the force and quickly called his lightsaber to her hand. It was thinner than she was used to. It felt like it was cutting into her palm, and the hilt was inexplicably long. She didn't know where to hold it. While it wasn't her baby, it would do in a pinch. She almost laughed aloud at the shocked look on Rajan's face. She stopped running back and ignited the lightsaber. Surprisingly, a bright blue blaze shone out. She was extremely confused. Very few planets in the galaxy have blue Aegan crystals, and they were all policed by the Jedi. She'd been expecting the red synthetic crystals common to almost all dark side users. She supposed he could have made synthetic crystals that were blue instead of red, but she didn't see what the point of that would be. These were more thoughts she forced from her mind. She had much more important things to worry about. As Rogan recovered from his surprise and started walking towards her again, Kinsa reached with her left hand to unclip the stun baton on her belt. The metal of the stun baton was Cortos's, one of the few metals in the galaxy able to withstand a lightsaber, so she was sure it would be able to connect with Rajan's sword without breaking. She knew the stun wouldn't hurt him or slow him down. It was a well-known fact in the galaxy that, because of their tough scales, a gun set on stun would have absolutely no effect on a Barabel, so she assumed it would be the same with a stun baton, but she was just hoping it would be enough to give her a slight edge. He got to her, and before he could heave his sword, she launched her attack. She spun in circles, becoming a strange and confusing whirlwind with both weapons striking out at him. Scene change. Never had Darth Naaman hated that stupid lightsaber more than he did now. He had her dead to rights until she'd grabbed his own weapon from him. Now she was facing off against him with two weapons instead of none. He felt the stun baton stinging across his scales as the Twi'lek Jedi spun in a confusing, untrackable cyclone. He focused solely on the lightsaber and let the stun baton pass. He roughed his defenses unimpeded. He didn't understand her attack. She was striking high, then moving low, stabbing forward at him and swinging her saber behind her, the entire time spinning, seemingly just to confusing him. The stinging worsened as she landed blow after blow, and he knew eventually it would get to him. Every time that the humming metal baton struck against his scales, it hurt a little more. He tried to concentrate on her actions, not just her lightsaber. As he did, the spinning, link blades seemed to slow slightly, and he saw an opening. He reached out with his left hand and tried to claw at her head. The stinging and the spinning finally stopped as she leaned back, trying to avoid his grasp. Darth Naaman's sharp claws scraped across her throat just as she moved back out of reach, drawing thin red lines in her pale yellow skin. He grunted in frustration. She had been so close. He spun to the left before she could begin her whirlwind, leading his sword with one hand. She stepped back again, avoiding the blade, and so began their game, her jumping and ducking, striking out with whatever weapon she could whenever she saw the smallest opening, and him pressing down on her with broad, devastating strokes, trying to pin her down and only moving to the defensive when he had to. It was a dangerous situation for both of them. Eventually, he would be too fast for her to keep dodging, and eventually her lightsaber would slip past his sword enough times that he wouldn't be able to block it with the Force. Scene change. She continued retreating from Rajan's towering figure, dodging and attacking, trying to get an opening. She was terrified and frustrated at the same time. Ducking under a slash, she felt the razor-sharp blade swoosh just above her flailing Leku, almost cutting another piece off. She slashed at his legs with both weapons. He lifted one leg and kicked at her right wrist, knocking the lightsaber askew and letting the stun baton slap harmlessly into his other leg. Without missing a beat, he brought his sword down, forcing her to abandon her low attack and sidestep out of the way. She took a few steps back to give herself some space and felt something against her ankle. She couldn't look down to see what it was, and she had to move back to avoid a stab from Rogan. She lifted her leg high, hoping she could clear whatever rubble was behind her. As her foot came down, she felt it hit something squishy. The unsolidness surprised her and she drew pat to her back. Scene change. So caught up in the attack and defense, she had tripped on a millennial's body. So now Kinsa, his greatest and only living enemy, lay supine on her back before him atop the decimated body of his only other enemy, with her lightsaber extinguished next to her outstretched hand. Her stun baton was still clutched in her other hand, but that wasn't really a danger. He placed the tip of Kaisik Garifun on her chest, ready to press down and end it, when something stopped him. He thought back to all the amazing things he had seen Kinsa do, all the potential she had for greatness. It seemed like a waste to just destroy someone with such amazing gifts, especially someone who was clearly already on a dark path. He knew the rule of two forbade any apprentices to have apprentices, but he didn't see the harm in doing this. He would spend all of his time training and would only contact her rarely, so it wouldn't actually be like he had an apprentice. It would just be good for him to have someone in place for when he was ready to wrest the mantle of Lord of the Sith from his master, so he didn't have to rush to find someone else. How could he pass up a sure thing, someone so strong in the Force, someone who could make such a difference to the Sith cause? I've got two options for you, he told her in all seriousness. Oh, and what are they? She panted, sarcasm dripping from her voice. Death, he told her, punctuating this by pushing his sword just a centimeter in forward, the tip cutting into her chest and drawing blood that trailed down her yellow chest. Or, you could become my secret apprentice. Scene change. If she wasn't about to die, Kinsa may have just left. Either Rogan was joking and he had made a pretty good joke, or he was serious. Either way, it was a hilarious suggestion. I can tell by your face you think it's stupid, but think about it. He continued. Evidently, he was serious. Why are you a Jedi? You don't belong with them. You're only a Jedi because they picked you up when you were a young child, weak and vulnerable, and brainwashed you into believing it was the only option. He was a few years off, but, besides that, he was right. You can do so much more with the Sith. Instead of hiding away in some temple surrounded by bureaucrats, you can travel the galaxy and do things. Be honest with yourself. What do you owe the Jedi? Even if you did owe them something once, don't you think after all you've given you're even by now? Keen's honestly thought about it, not for the first time. What did she owe the Jedi? They had given her shelter and training, but that was it. And, while that's nothing to brush off, she had given her life. She'd done so much for the Jedi and then they didn't even have the decency to talk to her when she has an idea. She owed the Jedi nothing. Everything she'd ever done was for the Jedi. No, she realized, her thoughts stopping in their tracks, everything she'd done hadn't been for the Jedi, it had been for the galaxy. For its inhabitants, for the Republic. No matter what she thought she did or didn't owe to the Jedi, the galaxy had chosen her and given her a connection to the living Force. That was a debt she could never repay. It wasn't just a decision of switching between Jedi and Sith like switching between sport teams. The Jedi helped, or at least tried to help, the galaxy, while the Sith just wanted to control it. She had found her rock. As the confusion and fear of her current situation rushed around her, she held on tight. No matter what, she was a servant of the people of the galaxy, and she couldn't be that as a Sith. She looked up at Naman with sternness in her eyes, completely assured in her decision. Death, she declared without hesitation. Rogan simply shrugged his shoulders and she felt searing pain sliding through her ribs into her chest. She knew she was dying, but she was dying as the person she wanted to be, a person who had given everything she could for as long as she could for the good of the galaxy. Scene change. Darth Naman looked over the destructive scene. The wall blown out, a giant circle of the floor completely destroyed, and the two cut-up mangled bodies. Then, for the first time, in a long time, he noticed the child cultists watching on. He had no idea what to do with them. He didn't want to be a leader of a cult, especially not to a bunch of kids, but it felt wrong just abandoning them too. He walked over to the older girl, maybe 13, who had saved the two younger children. She was a human girl with a soft round face riddled with brown freckles. She had long, straight brown hair tied in a single braid and slung over the front of her shoulder. She had bright yellow eyes tainted with sadness. As Darth Naman stood before her, she only reached up to his chest. She looked up at him with a determined, strong look. "Your name?" he asked her simply. "My name is Inonohi," she responded, her voice firm and confident, not shaking with fear as he would have expected. It was a promising sign. "If I provide you with the resources, do you believe you are capable of leading this group of Force sensitives and training them? I can provide you with food, water, someone to rebuild this compound and the scrolls and manuscripts you will need for training." The young girl grew silent and thought for a moment, truly considering the question. Another good sign. "Yes," she finally responded. "But, on one condition. I think we should find a new temple to make our home on the planet. This one had too many bad memories." He nodded. "As you wish." He pulled a comlink from his belt and handed it to her. "When you find your new base of operations, contact me on that and I will make all the necessary arrangements. This cult, or whatever you want to call it, is yours now and you will build into it what you will. But, my one condition is this: there will come a time when I or one of my successors will come to you. When that time comes, you will serve without hesitation or question." "Understood?" The girl kept silent and nodded her head, this time without hesitation. "Pass this down to future generations and future leaders. The time will come, he pressed. The girl nodded again and Naaman turned to walk off. This would be another secret he kept from his master. He had plenty of money from the Bogan to supply the small group of children, and one day it might pay off. Sir. He heard the girl call from behind him. He turned around to see her holding out two lightsabers. One had a thin hilt with blood-red lines wrapping around it, millennials. The other, which belonged to Kinsa, was made of beautifully carved metal, silver, bronze and gold masterfully woven together with some kind of stone he didn't recognize near the activator. He reached out with the force and plucked them from the girl's hand, nodding his thanks. Without trying, he had started somewhat of a collection. First, he took Griff's beautiful and different staff, then he'd had to keep the three assassins' weapons a secret, so he'd kept those, and now he would be adding these two to the collection. He placed them on his belt and slid Kyasik Derifin into its scabbard as he walked back out the hole he had created. One day soon, he would add his master's strange weapons to his gallery.